Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 26. May to June 1917. "Oh, and Granny's is gone," Rollins added. "Shove?" Thomas asked, wondering if the old lady was all right. To his surprise, Major Clarkson had not forgotten about his request for a day off to go to London, and when the date for General Strutt's visit to the convalescent home was confirmed, he told Thomas to hurry up and take it before the preparations were in full swing. "Oh, no," Rollins said. "She just left. Evacuated further back, I think. We went there one day, and it was, egg and chips and girls with their blouses half undone. Tried to get the story out of them, but they didn't parlay." By now, Rollins had brought Thomas up to date, or at least up to a month and a half ago, when he'd left the 47th, on their friends and acquaintances, starting with the cat, and working his way down in importance. He hadn't raised any topics more substantial than unit gossip, and Thomas was beginning to wonder if perhaps "I wouldn't mind seeing you" was not the urgent summons he had taken it for. "Sounds like you got out just in time," he noted. "Yeah, the place is really going downhill," Rollins agreed. "And look at you getting out when you did. Ward master?" "It's not all it's cracked up to be," Thomas admitted. "Our ward master, he pretty much only had to answer to Major Thwaite, and he let him pretty much do what he wanted. I have to answer to Major Clarkson, Lady Grantham, the ward sister, and Carson." Rollins frowned. "Carson's your butler, right?" "Not my butler," Thomas said. "If he was, I'd sack him. The rest of them aren't so bad, but they all have different ideas of what I ought to be doing." "Typical," Rollins said. "Still, at least there's no one actually shooting at you." "True," Thomas admitted, but he never really minded that part. "And the patients are in pretty good shape by the time we get them." Not that he'd minded that part either. He changed the subject. "What about you? How are they treating you here?" He figured if there was actually anything wrong, that might put Rollins on the subject. "Oh, not bad. The physios, you know how they run you ragged." "Yeah," Thomas agreed, flexing his bad shoulder. "They told me this might not be quite enough to get me invalided out," Rollins added, indicating the stump of his leg. "Above the knee, they let you out. Below, they have to think about it." "Oh, yeah," Thomas said. "We've got a bloke with an artificial foot. Wainwright. He does all right." "Yeah?" Thomas asked. "That wouldn't be so bad if they'd send me to your lot." Was that what it was he wanted? Thomas eyed him evaluatively. "We could use it, Corporal. Haven't had one since I got promoted." He didn't have a lot of pull with Major Clarkson, but he might have some. "When are you getting out?" "Not for ages," Rollins said. "At least 6 months, they said. Could all be over by then," he added optimistically. "Could be," Thomas said more dubiously. Getting Rollins transferred to him certainly wasn't an emergency then, but he could start laying the groundwork. "Got my hopes up a little when the Americans declared, but they don't seem in much of a hurry to muck in." The papers had made a big thing of the arrival of some American ships to patrol for U-boats, but unless it was being kept secret, they hadn't actually landed anyone in France yet. "No, but the Germans have got to be shitting themselves," Rollins said. "They're already in a bad way. We had some prisoners come through. One of them had some English and told Collins they had rations cut twice already this year. The bread they get is half sawdust, and they only kept going because their brass told them we were even worse off. When Collins took them something from our mess, they just about cried." "Old buggers," Thomas said automatically. Could Rollins be right? He ought to want a quick end to the war. He did want it, really. But it would mean facing up to a lot of things he'd been avoiding. "Keep me posted, though. If it's not over by then and it looks like they're keeping you in, I'll see if my CO can pull any strings. It'd be great to have you." Just what he needed, really. His own right-hand man. "All right," Rollins said. "To be honest, I'm not that keen on getting out as long as I don't end up somewhere shuffling papers around. I go home, Mother's going to have me wrapped up in cotton wool faster than you can say knife." Once again, Thomas was reminded that where Rollins ended up by not trying was better than anywhere Thomas could scheme himself into, but there was no point in blaming Rollins for it. It was nearly tea time, so Rollins used all his charm to convince the ward sister to let him out to go to the pub, and when that didn't work, they headed down to the mess, Rollins swinging along easily on his crutches. Unsurprisingly, Rollins had accumulated about a table's worth of friends, and he proudly showed Thomas off to them. It was a good day. A day when no one was looking to Thomas for immediate and universally approved of solutions to all their problems. Taking a late train back to Yorkshire, Thomas thought that even though it had turned out Rollins hadn't needed him, he had needed it. The next day, everything was back to normal. They had less than 10 days before General Strutt's visit, and while Thomas would just as soon have spat in his eye, he wasn't about to let him catch them looking less than their best. Mid-morning found him walking through the house with his clipboard again, this time with Miss Hughes, identifying everything that needed to be cleaned, polished, or repaired, and deciding whether it would be handled by the maids or the orderlies. "Right," Thomas said as they entered the main hall. "So I can have my lads wash the windows as long as—" "Ethel!" Miss Hughes said, bustling over to where Ethel was standing amid a group of patients. "Have you finished with the bedrooms already?" "No, Miss Hughes," she said. "I just came down to get another duster." "And you thought these gentlemen might have one?" Miss Hughes scoffed. Thomas turned his attention to the patients. "Was there something you needed, sirs?" He almost wished Ethel would go back to flirting with his men. Them, at least, he could shout at. "Oh, no, Sergeant," said one of them, a Major Bryant. "Are you sure? Because it'd be no trouble to send an orderly to assist you with anything you may need." "No, thank you," the Major repeated. "Very good, sir," Thomas said, and rejoined Miss Hughes a little distance away. Shaking her head, she said, "Ethel takes more watching than the rest of them put together." "I had to chase her out of the orderly's room last week," Thomas admitted, though he forbore to mention that she'd been sitting on Griff's knee at the time. "Seems she's moved on to greener pastures." "I'll have to speak to her again," Miss Hughes said. "Now, what were you saying about the windows?" Thomas picked up his train of thought. "I can have my men wash them if the maids polish the stair railings and black the grates." Miss Hughes agreed to this plan, and they moved on to discussing whether it was feasible to dust the pillars and archways here in the hall, a monumental task normally undertaken when the family was in London for the General's visit. Thomas, suspecting that Miss Hughes had started thinking of this occasion as an excuse to catch up on tasks that had fallen to the wayside, now that they had only one hall boy and one rather wobbly footman, came down firmly on the side that it was not. They went into the library, next Miss Hughes conceding, "The bookcases are certainly due for polishing," but explaining, "If the maids were to do it, we'd have to bar them in from using it for an afternoon. It wouldn't be proper for them to be up on ladders with men about." Her argument was, Thomas thought, weakened by the sight of Lady Edith nimbly descending a library ladder with a book in hand. She handed it to a young lieutenant who was waiting at the foot of the ladder, whose crutches served as silent explanation for why he hadn't made the ascent himself. "I do think you'll like this one," she was saying, "but if you don't, we'll try again." "I'm keeping an eye on that, too," Thomas assured Miss Hughes once they were out of Lady Edith's earshot. Lady Mary had lost interest in the patients within a day or two of their arrival, but Lady Edith was a frequent visitor, recommending books or walks to the patients, providing a fourth for bridge or listening ear, and running their errands in the village. It struck Thomas as a slightly odd pastime for a young lady, but it did seem to cheer the men up. "I see," Miss Hughes said. "I trust you'll alert her ladyship if there was anything she might be concerned about." "Of course," Thomas said. Respectable young ladies were thin on the ground in France, at least in the areas near the front, but Thomas hadn't seen any signs that any of the officers had forgotten how to behave around one. After they finished the walk-through, Thomas went back to his office, where he found a letter from the ward-master waiting for him. "DB, I best not say much about GSHS, Hero of the Psalm, because you never know what might count as sensitive information, and I'd hate to give the poor sod censoring my letters an aneurysm. But yeah, I've heard what you've heard. I wouldn't like it much if he turned up here either, but yeah, only thing you could do really is show him that some people know how to do the fucking jobs." In the outer part of the room, Griff's voice rose. "So I says to her, we're laying down our lives. The least you can do is lay down, and she slaps me, of course, but—" It turned out Thomas needn't have worried about the men being unable to relax with the orderly's room doubling as his office. From the sound of it, Griff had quite forgotten that he was back here at his desk behind the linen shelves when he'd started in on one of his estimate girl stories. With that latest remark, Thomas went from wondering if he ought to step out and remind them that the nurses came into this room too when they needed to get linens or drugs, to deciding how he'd time his entrance for the greatest impact. Unfortunately, someone else got there first. "What in heaven's name do you think you're doing?" Carson boomed. "Get your filthy boots off the table before I have you horsewhipped, and you!"
Smoking upstairs! Thomas barreled out from behind the linen shelves. Hut!
Both men, it was Griffiths and Parker, jumped to their feet and braced up. Thomas left them like that and wheeled on Carson. "Mr. Carson," he said, his voice dead level, "you have no business giving orders to my men, and for your information, they're allowed to smoke in here." Carson drew himself up.
I am the butler here, and
Thomas cut him off. "And I am the wardmaster. These men are in the king's service, not Lord Grantham's. They're my responsibility."
we'll see about that,
Carson sputtered. "Yes," Thomas said. "We will." Thomas turned away from Carson, attempting to communicate with the gesture his utter conviction that Carson would remove himself from Thomas's presence post-haste. Griffith and Parker were fighting not to smirk, and then they were losing until Thomas said, "Don't look so pleased with yourselves. You're allowed to smoke in here. You're not allowed to put your feet on the furniture. Which one of you was it?"
Me, Sergeant,
Parker said.
but it wasn't really on the table, just
"I don't care. You'll polish it after you finish your shift." Parker wisely chose not to argue further. "Yes, Sergeant." That's right, you are getting a fucking bollocking," Thomas thought. Seeing out of the corner of his eye that Carson had finally left, he continued, "And you both know better than to tell wacky stories in here where the nurses might walk in any minute."
Yes, Sergeant,
they agreed in wobbly chorus. "You're both in the sink room for the rest of the afternoon," Thomas told them. "And if I come down there at tea time and everything isn't spotless, you'll stay there until it is. Dismissed." They left, and Thomas stomped back around the shelves to his desk. If he was Wardmaster Tooley, he'd have poured himself a drink, but since he was Wardmaster Barrow, he lit a cigarette and picked his letter back up. "You might have thought of this, but I'd be careful what you say to your lads about him. Don't want them getting the idea it's all right to be disrespectful to his face. On the other hand, if anyone's especially riled up, you might pull him aside and let him know you don't like it either. You know how that goes." Thinking of the times the wardmaster had told him things that were, in his phrasing, not to spread around, Thomas realized that he did indeed know how that went. "This Carson character sounds like a tough nut to crack. With you being in different chains of command, there's only so much you can do. I'd say staying out of his way is the best course, except it sounds like you're in each other's pockets up there. Things here are about as much of a mess as usual. I put Widener up for your old section." The last few lines of the letter were about how Widener was struggling with his new responsibilities. Thomas read them carefully for any clues as to his own situation, but found nothing. Well, he supposed it had been asking a lot to hope that the wardmaster would have the key to fixing with Carson from the other side of the channel. Putting the letter away, he wrote up his notes from the meeting with Miss Hughes into a plan for getting the work done on time, and then went into the orderly's lunch. Once again, everybody stopped what they were doing and braced up. "As you were," Thomas said. "Are we still doing that?" he asked. He'd been hoping they would stop on their own eventually, but it was starting to seem unlikely. "We decided," Wiggins explained, "that if we have to stand up for that stuffed shirt Carson, we're damned if we won't do it for our wardmaster." "Oh," Thomas said, nonplussed. He thought it most likely that they were doing it out of a slightly confused notion of how things were done in a house like this. He hadn't entirely ruled out piss-taking as a motivation, but it hadn't occurred to him that they might be taking the piss out of Carson. "Carry on, then," he said, filling his place. "Sort of a shame we can't actually see you doing it, though."
Well, Sarge, Franklin said, if you came to the mess on time, the kitchen girls might see you tell 'em like.
It was a nice thought, but unlikely. Carson doesn't fraternize with the kitchen girls.
Said Wiggins, a speculative look in his eye.
Later that day, Thomas went downstairs to check how Wainwright and Franklin were getting along with inventorying the medical supplies. Wainwright was sitting in a kitchen chair writing things down as Franklin counted them.
At the sight of Thomas, Wainwright jumped to his feet and they both braced up.
No one was going to see that either unless they happened to be walking by at just the right moment, but it was a nice try, Thomas supposed. "As you were," he said, taking Wainwright's clipboard and scanning it. "How are we going through this much 3-inch bandaging?"
"Oh, well,"
Franklin said. He didn't actually shuffle his feet, but he looked as though he might start at any moment. "What?" Thomas asked. Franklin hesitated.
"Nurse Finch Brown."
She was one of the new VADs who had been sent for the convalescent home and seemed an unlikely thief. "What's she been doing with it?"
"Putting it in the burn bed," Franklin admitted, "with the gauze and lint."
"What, all of it?"
They sometimes burned bandages if they were very badly soiled, but with convalescent patients, most of the time the bandages were fit to use again once they'd been boiled and re-rolled. Only for the dressing changes she did before yesterday afternoon, Wainwright said. It's all right, Franklin added. I explained and she understands now. Thomas briefly considered sending someone, possibly Finch Brown herself, out to the burn pile to see if any bandages could be salvaged. But even if they hadn't been burned, they'd have hardened into a mass with all of the material which was supposed to be burnt. I see, he said. Anything else we're unexpectedly short of? She's not throwing away splints of thermometers when she's done with them. Don't think so, Sarge, Franklin said. Thomas resolved to review the completed inventory with extra care. Over the next few days, the orderlies found more and more occasions to stand up when Thomas entered a room. Palmer just happened to be sitting in the kitchen when Thomas went down to check on a change in the patient's menus. Griff took to doing his lawyering in the servants' hall rather than the orderlies' room. A couple of chairs appeared in the sink room, and when Thomas appeared downstairs, there was a race to sit in them, and then get up again. All the more impressive because sink room duty was usually assigned to whoever he was least pleased with at any given time. He knew it was working when Bates pulled him aside before dinner one night, an expression of vaguely constipated concern on his face, to ask if Thomas really thought it a good idea to stand on ceremony to that degree. Thomas was half tempted to leave him in the dark, but given how things worked here, it was likely halfway to being an article of faith among the staff that Thomas was forcing his men to pander to his sense of self-importance. Oh, that's none of my idea, he said. They're doing it because they think Carson's putting on airs, making you not stand up whenever he comes into a room. Really? Bates said skeptically. Thomas nodded. Especially since he only has 3 men working under him. Barely enough to make a patrol, Griff had said scornfully. And I have 20. Bates sighed. Oh, you really haven't put them up to it. No, Thomas said almost ruefully. They figured out he was a wanker all on their own. It isn't helping matters when it comes to Mr. Carson. They didn't think it was, Thomas answered. I'll get them to knock it off when it stops being funny. He paused. If it ever does. Thomas half wondered if, now that Bates had broached the topic, the rest of them would feel free to weigh in over dinner. But it was Lang's turn in the hot seat instead, with Carson touching over how he could possibly rely on him to serve dinner to General Sir Herbert Strutt, hero of the Somme, after some undescribed but dire misstep he had committed in the dining room that night. His lordship, Carson pontificated, has chosen to tolerate Henry's difficulties, but we cannot expect similar forbearance from a distinguished guest. What did he do? Thomas asked Anna in a whisper. I'm not sure, Anna said. Something about forgetting to clean something, I think. Golly, Thomas said more loudly. No, it isn't as though General Strutt has ever made a mistake nearly as bad as that. Across the table, Lang gave him a quick glance before saying piously, Mr. Carson is right. I must be more careful. But will that be enough, Henry? Asked Carson. Will it be enough? A portentous silence followed, broken by Miss Hughes saying, Weren't you saying earlier today that it would be difficult to manage a grand enough dinner with just one footman? Suddenly everyone was looking at Thomas while trying to look as though they weren't. Oh, fuck no! Thomas managed not to actually say it out loud. He also rejected his next 3 ideas for replies. You're joking, aren't you? You wouldn't let me work here when I actually wanted to, but now you're asking? In what fever dream do you imagine it would look remotely proper for Lord Grantham to have the convalescent home's medical staff acting as his personal servants? If only General Strutt hadn't made an absolute dog's dinner of planning the biggest military offensive in British history, I might still have the use of both my arms, and then he'd have someone to put his soup in front of him. Oh, he said instead. Were you thinking of asking to borrow some men? Who did you have in mind? Pruitt or Wainwright, perhaps? Those 2, like him and Lang, were survivors of the Somme. Ethel asked, Isn't Pruitt the one with the... She traced a line across her face, bisecting her nose and mouth. Yes, Thomas said. Little souvenir of the Somme. Wainwright lost his leg there. Lang lost his wits, and of course I've got my shoulder. Excellent idea, Mr. Carson. I'm sure the General will enjoy having a good look at what he's done to us all. Carson drew himself up. How dare you? Miss Hughes placed a placating hand on his arm and asked Thomas, "Is it really fair to blame the General personally?" "He watched it," Thomas answered. "That's why they have the hero of the psalm driving around England getting his photograph taken, because they'd already made him out to be a military genius before they realized what a spectacular cock-up he made of it. So yes, I'd say it's fair. Support came from an unexpected quarter." "Is right," Miss O'Brien said. "And he and Henry and those other two, they're the lucky ones. My brother was killed there. We didn't find out for months because there were so many dead. Why shouldn't General Sir Herbert Strutt see the butcher's bill?" What was she playing at? For more than 3 years gone, she'd not have agreed with him that water was wet. He was vaguely aware of Miss Hughes saying, "Well, I don't think we'll be doing that." "It wasn't a serious suggestion," he replied, most of his attention still on O'Brien. She can't have thought that chiming in would actually help, and indeed Carson was working up a head of steam. "If you think," he said, "that you're going to do anything to disrupt the General's visit—" Thomas cut him off. "Wasn't planning to. So it wasn't an olive branch from O'Brien, that was for damn sure. Might not want to tempt me, though," he added, and was vaguely aware of Carson drawing in his breath sharply. Had she just said it to stir things up? No, O'Brien certainly wasn't above fanning the flames of an argument for the fun of it, but this one hadn't even been close to dying out. And besides, if that was what she was after, she'd have made some kind of insinuation, playing the two sides against one another, not flat out choosing one. The only explanation left, after ruling out all the others, was that she'd said it because she meant it. He meant to say something about how unlike her that was, but what came out instead was it Paul?" Her eyes flashed. "None of your business." It must have been. He was the only one of her brothers she cared about. Shut it!" Her tone was dangerous, and Thomas, after carefully considering his options, decided to shut it. Carson, meanwhile, was still trying to talk about the dinner party. "I suppose, then, that I shall have to manage as best I can with Henry." Now that he was deliberately not thinking about O'Brien and was distracted from his dislike of General Sir Herbert Strutt, hero of the psalm, Thomas automatically began thinking of solutions to Carson's problem. He could give Arthur the hallboy a crash course in waiting at table and stick him in livery for the evening. He could ask Mr. Molesley or Mr. Spratt, Miss Crawley and the Dowager Countess's butlers for help. He could telephone an employment agency and see if they had anyone suitable looking for temporary work. A long shot, given that by now most men were in uniform, but you never knew your luck. He could get nodded, was what he could do. This was not Thomas's problem to solve. "Sounds like it," he said cheerfully. When dinner ground to an end, O'Brien quickly went out into the courtyard. Thomas, after a moment's hesitation, followed her. She was stood up against the wall, smoking angrily. Thomas selected a patch of wall not too far away from her, but not too close either, and lit up. "Sorry about your brother," she snorted. Thomas smoked some more, and eventually she said, "I mean it, you know. You and Henry Lang are the lucky ones." "I know," he said. He thought that might be it, but after a long pause she said, "Her ladyship doesn't know. She asks about him, and I lie, because she'd say how dreadful it is, and how sorry she is, when she wouldn't lift a finger to stop it being sent back." Thomas had his doubts about whether her ladyship could have done anything had she tried, the War Office's insatiable appetite for warm bodies to throw into the meat grinder being what it was. But there wasn't any point saying that. "Yeah, so what I want to know," she went on, "is how did you manage it, you rotten little sneak?" "What?" Thomas's first thought was that she was accusing him of getting her brother sent back, though both how he do that and why were equally mysterious. "Why are you still here?" The question was somewhere between an accusation and a plea. She wasn't asking why he was in the courtyard. She was asking why he was alive, and Paul, if it had been Paul, wasn't. "Don't know," he said. Lied, really. He knew why he was alive. Rollins and Rouse and Jessup and Captain Allenby and the wardmaster. They weren't the only reasons, of course. A lot of it was luck. Terrifyingly blind chance. If the bullet had hit him in a worse spot, or if it had been dirtier, or if it had taken longer to find a blood donor, he'd have died anyway. But the other part, the only part that actually made any sense, was that he was alive because his friends had cared enough to keep him that way. And that was pretty terrifying, too.
Well,
Mr. Carson said acidly.
so much for relying on Thomas's good nature.
You don't have to say, I told you so.
Miss Hughes answered just as tartly. Thomas had been so reasonable about planning the cleaning for the general's visit that she thought he just might be willing to help with the dinner as well.
It might have worked if you had actually asked him,
I wouldn't lower myself.
Mr. Carson declared, and that was precisely why it might have worked. She didn't entirely understand it, but Mr. Carson and Thomas both saw asking for help as an act of self-abasement, but it was one of those matters, of which there were more than either of them would admit, in which they were in perfect accord. She didn't doubt that Thomas would have enjoyed having Mr. Carson come to him with hat in hand, but he also would have recognized that he would only do so if the reason was very important.
Well then, she said, it seems that standing on your pride matters more to you than the grandness of General Strott's dinner.
Mr. Carson shook his head and began pouring their after-dinner sherry.
You're a cruel woman, Miss Hughes.
If you say so.
She had no particular opinion as to which of those things really did matter more. As far as she was concerned, neither of them was important as Mr. Carson thought it was. But she was growing weary of Mr. Carson carrying on about the lowering of standards in the dining room while refusing every alternative available to him.
Speaking of cruel women,
He continued, handing her a glass.
am I correct in supposing that Miss O'Brien and Thomas have achieved a rapprochement?
Not that I've noticed,
She said. Granted, neither of them had done anything particularly spiteful to the other recently, at least nothing that had come to her attention, but an absence of active malice and a mutual dislike of a public figure seemed a thin basis on which to rebuild a friendship.
Oh,
He asked,
that's one bit of good news.
remembering Thomas saying months ago that he'd like to mend fences with Miss O'Brien. She wasn't so sure it was good. Something wrong, Nurse Crawley? Thomas asked. He'd stepped outside to look for her after the last of the patients she'd been accompanying up from the hospital came inside, but she didn't. He found her standing off to one side of the drive, her hands on her hips, looking off in the opposite direction.
Oh,
she said, turning around. I'm sorry, I was wool gathering. She looked more like she had been stewing than wool gathering. Thomas raised an eyebrow.
Bronson is insufferable,
She declared. Thomas was half tempted to ask why, then she was suffering him, he being a chauffeur and she one of the young ladies of the house. But 10 feet away from the front door of Downton Abbey didn't seem like a particularly good place to tease Lady Sybil, even if she wasn't her Nurse Crawley role at the moment. Also, at this point, he could still honestly say that he didn't know that there was anything unusual between her and Branson. He suspected, certainly, but that wasn't the same thing as knowing. Telling anyone about a mere suspicion would be gossip. So he just said, oh, all I said was that I was glad he wasn't going to be killed or sent to prison, she elaborated. He took it entirely the wrong way. Thomas couldn't quite remember whether or not he was supposed to know that Branson was planning some act of idiocy when he reported for duty. If he decided not to, that explained the not getting arrested part, but not the not getting killed part. What happened? Oh, she said. Didn't he tell the rest of you? He failed his medical. She frowned. I hope it wasn't supposed to be a secret. I expect we'd notice him not leaving, Thomas pointed out. What's wrong with him? I don't know, she said. He just started carrying on about Ireland and how a cousin of his was killed by the authorities, I suppose, and... Oh, she realized. You mean his medical. He has a heart murmur. Thomas was a little surprised. That was enough to keep him out of it. Lucky old him, he said. That's what I thought. She shook her head. But now he says he has to find another way to make the government look foolish. Does he now? Thomas murmured. If he cares so much about Ireland, I don't know why he doesn't just go back. She continued. Thomas had a fairly good idea, but it was the thing they weren't talking about, so he just said, nothing's stopping him now that he doesn't have to go to France. Yes, Nurse Crawley said. I mean, no, there isn't. Nothing at all. She squared herself up and then went back inside and got to work on getting the patients settled. The next day at dinner, Carson was singing Branson's praises for having apparently volunteered to wait at table for the general's dinner.
I've no right to ask it of a chauffeur,
he pontificated.
but he
Here Carson paused to give Miss Hughes a significant look.
didn't wait to be asked.
That was certainly good of him, Miss Hughes said. Thomas was not at all certain of that, but after giving the matter a moment or two's thought, said nothing. Carson knew as much as the next bloke about Branson's political views, and if he didn't smell a rat, was it really Thomas's place to sow doubts? The dinner was, after all, nothing to do with him. Carson said agreeably.
I've decided that Branson will act as first footman. Henry, all you'll need to do is keep an eye on the water glasses and...
While Carson droned on about the various minor things Lang would have to do, all of which combined amounted to little more than stand in the corner and try not to fuck up, Thomas kept an eye on Lang. It was a slap in the face and no mistake, having his job handed over to some nobody who worked outdoors. Lang was taking it with an impassive face and murmured, "Yes, Mr. Carson," at appropriate intervals, but Thomas could see his left hand, which was shaking.
"And that should be more manageable for you, won't it?"
Carson concluded.
"Yes, Mr. Carson,"
Lang said. Thomas wondered if it had even occurred to Carson that there might be a reason not to do this in front of everyone. But he didn't have the luxury of worrying about it for long because now Carson had turned to him.
"We'll be getting some of the silver out of storage for the occasion,"
he began. Was he meant to apologize for it being in storage to begin with? He considered saying it was a good thing they were only storing it in the attic and not Timbuktu, but he suppressed the impulse and said instead, "That's nice."
"It will all need to be polished, of course, and since I will be fully occupied making certain that Branson understands how we wait at table in this house, I'll need you to assist Henry with it."
Oh, fuck no! Thomas once again suppressed his first impulse. "Will you?" he said, buying time to think of a better answer.
"Her ladyship and Miss Hughes assure me that you are committed to making the General's visit a success."
Carson did have him there. "You might have mentioned it when we were planning how to get everything done in time," he pointed out, running through the next day's schedule mentally. "Not really like you to leave it till the last minute, is it?" Miss Hughes gave him an arch look, and he hurried on. "All right, I can give you 2 men in the afternoon between 2 and 4. That brief window between tea and afternoon dressing changes was about the only time he had for last-minute things. "We were going to polish the bath chairs then, but if you can't manage, I suppose we'll just have to hope the General doesn't look at them." Carson was shaking his head.
"Oh, no,"
he said jovially.
"I'm afraid you've misunderstood. We can't possibly entrust the family's silver to your men. I'll need you to do it."
"Oh, fuck no!" Momentarily caught flat-footed, Thomas gave Carson his best disbelieving stare while he thought up his next move. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Carson. I'm busy with my own job. As I said, I can make some men available to you, though I'll be going to some trouble to do it, but that's really the best I can do."
"Mr. Carson,"
Bates jumped in.
"I'd be happy to help with the silver and supervise the men that Thomas is able to lend us, if that would help." "Thank you, Mr. Bates,"
he said, not taking his eyes off Thomas.
"but I have discussed this with her ladyship, and we all agreed that Thomas will do it."
Oh, fuck, no. The worst of it was he could easily see her doing just that. She had no idea what he did all day when he wasn't meeting with her, and it was well within Carson's capabilities to put it to her in such a way that it seemed a reasonable request, instead of the naked attempt to get Thomas under his thumb again that it so obviously was. Bates tried again.
"Carson, I'm not sure. Thank you, Mr. Bates, but this doesn't concern you. Thomas?"
"Sergeant Barrow," he corrected automatically, and that showed him the way out. "I'm afraid her ladyship may have overstepped her authority just a bit. She was directress of the convalescent home, but that didn't place her in his chain of command, not exactly. As you know, I take my orders from Major Clarkson."
"Who has ordered you to cooperate with her ladyship?"
Carson reminded him. "Indeed he has," Thomas agreed. "Still, I believe I'll check with him on this one."
"Whatever you think best,"
Carson said in such a way as to make the undercurrent of "it's your funeral" as clear as day.
"We'll start immediately after the upstairs luncheon. Don't be late."
Naturally, Thomas spent most of the night wondering whether it was in fact a bad idea to appeal to Major Clarkson. The army did not exactly look kindly on people arguing about their orders, or arguing about who had the right to give them orders. And while Major Clarkson knew what her ladyship could be like, he'd also made pretty clear that handling her ladyship was one of the things he'd chosen Thomas to do. He might have knuckled under. He was halfway to convincing himself that having raised the scepter of Major Clarkson was enough to make the point that he didn't actually answer to Carson, except that he genuinely did not have time to do it without obviously neglecting things that really were his responsibility. Another thing he didn't really have time for was walking down to the hospital to talk to Major Clarkson, but since the alternative was to try to explain while the Major was making his rounds on the wards, an occasion that her ladyship often dropped in on, he did it anyway. Between one thing and another, it had been a couple of weeks since he'd been in the hospital. Little about it had changed, but on entry, he was struck by the smell. A heavy mask of disinfectant over an underlayer of rot on the front. They'd have had a convoy in the last day or two to fill the places vacated by the patients who'd just moved up to the convalescent home. "Sergeant Barrow," Sister Crawley said, bustling over to him. "What brings you here?" Thomas generally did ask her a version of that same question when she turned up in his domain, so he supposed it was fair. "I needed to see Major Clarkson." "I'll see if he's free," she said importantly. Once she had bustled off, Thomas concentrated on not poking into things. It was more difficult than he would have guessed. Everywhere he looked, he saw things being done differently than he would have done them. An orderly mopping the floor while some others and a nurse were trying to gather up breakfast trays, for instance. The latter chores seemed to have been left a bit late. He'd timed his visit for after the morning busy period, and there was doubtless some good reason for that, but he'd have delayed the floor mopping and made the time up some other way. And one nurse making up trays for the mid-dressing changes. He'd always found it a bit more efficient to have two working at once. She could have had Anderson doing that instead of mopping the floor, and Thomas put himself at parade rest and tried not to notice anything else until Sister Crawley returned. "I couldn't see you," she reported, "but he's very busy. The general's visit, you know." "Yes, I know," Thomas said. "Thanks." Major Clarkson did indeed look busy. There were a number of files stacked in front of him and a small flock of telephone messages awaiting his attention. "Sergeant," he said, "what can I do for you?" Meanwhile, his face said, "This had best not be another problem I have to solve." Thomas knew the feeling. Unfortunately, Major Clarkson was in for a disappointment, as Thomas so often was. "Well, sir, there's a bit of a situation I'm not certain how to handle. I thought I'd best ask you." Major Clarkson took a deep breath. "What's happened?" "Mr. Carson, the butler, is insisting that I polish the silver for the general's visit tomorrow," Thomas explained. Said out loud, it really didn't seem like much of a problem. "I see. Sergeant, I'm sure you're a bit busy with your own preparations, but if you can spare a man or two to help him—" "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "That was the solution I thought of as well, but Mr. Carson believes that the man can't be trusted with it. He's insisting that I do it personally." The Major sighed. "That's not at all appropriate. Tell him you'll assign your most trustworthy men to the task." "Yes, sir. He informed me that Lady Grantham told him I would do it." Pinching the bridge of his nose, Major Clarkson said, "Is there more?" "No, sir. That was the point where I decided I should ask what you wanted me to do." He hesitated. "Except that Mr. Bates, his lordship's valet, offered to do it or supervise my men or whatever would help, and Mr. Carson insisted that it had to be me." He'd hesitated over whether to mention that part, but decided that Major Clarkson ought to know just how unreasonable Carson was being. "Why?" Major Clarkson asked. "He didn't say, sir," Thomas said, because explaining to his commanding officer that Carson hated him was where he drew the line. Major Clarkson sighed again. "I don't suppose," he said carefully, "that you could find a spare hour somehow, just to keep the peace?" "I would, sir," Thomas lied, "but it'll take most of the afternoon. I was planning to talk to the laundry about the changes to the linen schedule, go over the records from the morning dressing changes, walk around the house with the housekeeper to check that all the special cleaning has been done satisfactorily, do a bit of saluting drill with the men, supervise afternoon dressing changes, be available to you during your afternoon rounds, and attempt to get a firm commitment from her ladyship on what we're showing the general tomorrow. If you feel that polishing the silver is a better use of my time, of course I'll do that instead. Sir." "You know that I do not." The Major's tone was a bit sharp. "Yes, sir," Thomas said apologetically, "but I'm not sure exactly what you'd like me to do about it." That was, after all, why he'd come here. He didn't need any help to tell that Carson was being unreasonable. Major Clarkson sighed. "Send him a man or two?" Tell him how sorry you are that you can't help him personally. I'll handle Lady Grantham." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. Sometimes he really did love being in the army. The rest of the morning went smoothly. After giving some thought to who he'd offer up to Carson, he finally settled on Wiggins and Griff. Wiggins because he was the most reliable, Griff because proximity to the maids would take the edge off of having to kowtow to Carson. He called them both into his office and explained that they would be spending the afternoon helping Mr. Carson. "I know it's not a popular assignment, but somebody has to do it. I chose you two because I know I can count on you." They both nodded, and Wiggins said, "Sure you can, Sarge." So far, so good. This was the part he'd hesitated over telling them. But it wasn't fair to send them in blind, and if he managed to put it to them right, they'd appreciate the point he was making to Carson. "He's going to be in an especially foul mood because he planned on forcing me to do it myself." Wiggins actually gasped at that. Good man. "Major Clarkson nixed that," Thomas told them, since it didn't hurt to let them know their CO had his back. "But the whole reason Carson did it is because he doesn't like that I don't work for him anymore, and he wanted to take me down a peg." That was an understatement, but it would do. "He isn't going to like that I wiggle out of it, and he's not above taking it out on you." "Like how?" Wiggins asked. "Like making you do everything over 3 or 4 times before he's happy with it," Thomas said, "and making insulting remarks about you, or me, or God knows what. Just say, 'Yes, Mr. Carson,' and do what he tells you. He has you from lunch to tea, and if he wants to waste your time polishing the same thing all afternoon, that's his lookout." He paused. "That said, someone from the house, Lang or Bates, or maybe both of them, will be working with you, and if you fuck around, they'll tell me. I don't want any dumb insolence. Just don't worry about it if what he's telling you to do isn't going to get the job done. Understand?" "Got it," Wiggins said. Griff looked a little less certain, and Thomas told him, "Follow his lead. You'll both be fine. I'll come down at tea time and get you out." Thomas would have liked to send the two of them downstairs by themselves and deny Carson the opportunity to have a go at him, but he knew that was cowardly. After lunch, he went downstairs with them. The boot room table was already spread with silver, what struck Thomas as an improbable amount for one dinner, but he followed the advice he'd given his men and didn't concern himself with it. He tapped on the half-open door to Carson's pantry. Branson was in there, looking suspiciously alert and attentive as Carson held forth. Once again, Thomas followed his own advice. "Mr. Carson," he began. He could have done without this next bit, but having asked for orders, he had to follow the one he didn't like, too. "I'm very sorry, but unfortunately my duties won't permit me to help you with the silver this afternoon." Carson drew himself up, and Thomas barreled on. "I spoke with Major Clarkson, and he agreed that we should pitch in if we can. I was able to move some things around, and Private Wiggins and Private Griffiths here are available to you until tea time if you need them." Carson barely glanced at them before shaking his head.
"I'm afraid that won't do. As I explained, her ladyship agrees with me that we cannot entrust the silver to strangers."
Thomas was a little surprised that even Carson would accuse two men of theft to their faces for no reason other than that they worked for Thomas. He glanced at Wiggins and Griff, who had gone very stiff to either side of him before saying, "I'm sure you didn't realize how insulting that sounded, Mr. Carson. These are two of my best men. I've gone to some trouble to make them available to you, but if you don't want them, I have plenty for them to do. This is all you're getting. Take it or leave it." Carson glowered.
"Her ladyship will hear about this,"
he warned. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "Major Clarkson plans to speak to her about it." Carson's eyes widened. "I'm sure she didn't understand how inappropriate it was of her to promise the use of hospital personnel for household work," he said kindly. "It's a shame no one managed to stop her making such an embarrassing mistake. You dragged her into this. What did you think was going to happen? Now, do you want these two or not?" After much throat clearing and more apprehension, Carson said,
"I suppose, since you are determined to have your way, I'll have to ask Mr. Bates to supervise them."
"Good idea," Thomas said. "I knew if you thought about it, you'd come up with a solution." He looked at Wiggins and Griff again. "Thank you," he told them, "for agreeing to help Mr. Carson with his work. I'll look in on you when I can."
"No problem, Sarge,"
Wiggins said.
Yeah, you're welcome,"
Griff added.
"You all right, mate?"
Wiggins asked Lang, or Henry, or whatever they were supposed to call him. The four of them, he and Griff and Lang and Mr. Bates, had been polishing silver for a while now. For all of Sergeant Barrow's carrying on about it, it didn't seem so bad as fatigues went. It beat digging graves or latrines by a long chalk. It didn't wind you for one thing, so you could chat while you did it. Lang, though, had barely said a word, and every now and then Wiggins noticed his hands shaking.
I'm fine, he said. There's a lot to get done.
Wiggins glanced at the pile of silver still to be done and shrugged.
What do they need all this for, anyway?
It's just for show,
Bates said.
I know, Wiggins said. He understood the point of having things for show. His own mum had a best teeth set that had been her grandmother's, and nobody ever touched except dust. It made sense that really rich people would have more things like that, and having a lot of them, each one would be less important, so that maybe they'd use it sometimes. But while a lot of what they were polishing was just fancy versions of normal things, trays and candlesticks and bowls, there were some objects whose functions he couldn't even begin to guess.
But what's that for instance?
He pointed at a large silver thing that none of them had dared touch. It was basically a bowl sitting up on little animal feet, lion feet if Wiggins had to guess, except it also had a sort of roof over it, like the pagoda at Kew, and half a dozen arms sprouting smaller bowls. It reminded Wiggins of a plant his Nan had that if you didn't keep after it would grow little versions of itself on long vines, complete with roots and everything.
It's an eperdin, Lang said. You fill it with fruit and put it in the middle of the table.
Oh, Wiggins said. Is that why there's a pineapple on it?
The roof was crowned with a little silver pineapple.
Probably,
Lang said, adding,
They don't eat the fruit. Some houses use wax fruit, but we wouldn't dream of it here. It must be real and only the most perfect pieces. For them to throw away.
Though Lang was sitting right next to him, he sounded very far away. Wiggins glanced over at Bates, who, after all, knew Lang better than they did, to see if he found anything amiss. But Bates only said,
With the wartime shortages, I shouldn't be surprised if Miss Papa made something out of it later in the week.
I'm sorry,
Lady Grantham said, her voice low and quick.
I'm not sure that I understand what you are telling me.
Thomas, halfway through the door to the small library, would have made a quick exit, except that Major Clarkson had spotted him. Even indoors and hatless, military protocol demanded that he brace up and wait to be acknowledged. Running away was right out. I'm only saying, Major Clarkson said carefully, that using the convalescent home personnel for household work is a delicate matter.
General Sir Herbert Strutt is visiting the convalescent home, Lady Grantham pointed out, and the silver was put into storage to make room for the convalescent home supplies. What's more, my servants are doing extra work both for the General's visit and for ordinary operations of the convalescent home. I fail to see how it could be inappropriate to ask for one small favor in return.
I understand, Major Clarkson said, and as I said, we are doing our best to help. He looked over at Thomas again. Sergeant, were you able to free up a man or two to help Mr. Carson? Yes, sir, Thomas answered. Wiggins and Griffiths. They're at Mr. Carson's disposal until tea time, my lady. I mean to go and check how they're coming along after Major Clarkson's rounds. That was why he'd come looking for the Major in the first place. If he was otherwise occupied, Thomas could have gone downstairs before rounds instead of after. Very good, said Major Clarkson. I trust that's satisfactory, my lady? She hesitated.
Carson was concerned about having strangers handling some very significant pieces.
I'm sure Sergeant Barrow chose reliable men, Major Clarkson said with a glance at Thomas. Yes, sir, and Mr. Bates offered to supervise them, to allay Mr. Carson's concerns.
That's very helpful of him,
Lady Grantham said with a pointed look at Thomas. Thomas would have liked to point out that there were good reasons why he wasn't being helpful in that precise way, but doing so would only make this conversation last longer. They got started on rounds, Lady Grantham drifting along with them and chatting to the patients. Thomas's usual role in rounds was to point out the patients needing to be examined. Some were checked daily, others every second day, and some only if the nurse or orderly assigned noticed something the MO ought to see. On top of that, outside of the serious ward, the patients rarely stayed put, so it would be very easy to miss someone. Today, he also had to remove dressings for those of Wiggins and Griff's patients who were being examined, since they were otherwise occupied. Rounds finished, Thomas had no excuse to put off going downstairs. He found everyone hard at work in the boot room. Griff and Wiggins jumped to their feet at the sight of him, of course, and Thomas said, "As you were. How's it coming along?"
We thought we were nearly done,
Griff said darkly.
Mr. Carson thought otherwise.
Bates added. Thomas picked up a candlestick and examined it. "Oh, yeah. Missed the undersides of the vines on this one."
Must have been me, Wiggins confessed. I did one of those and Griff had the other, I think.
"You both missed them," Thomas said after checking the other one. "They're tricky. He'd probably polished those candlesticks 100 times and missed the undersides of the vines the first 50. Carson, of course, never told you what you'd missed, just made you do it again." Thomas examined some more pieces, pointing out the remaining spots of tarnish and setting aside a few that he couldn't find anything wrong with. He stopped short when he came to the monstrosity in the middle of the table. "He's not really going to use that," he said flatly. "That was a massive Rococo eperdine from the reign of George III, the most elaborate one in the household inventory. It was absolute hell to polish, and had been out of style since before Carson was born. As a footman, Thomas had spent a whole day each spring polishing it. He'd seen it used once for the Dowager Countess's birthday. She liked it for some reason.
That's the one he said he wanted,
Lang said.
We haven't tackled it yet,
Griff added.
Wig's afraid of it.
As well he should be.
"Did Mr. Carson say anything about it when he came in to check your work?" Thomas asked. If he had, it would be difficult for him to plausibly claim he hadn't noticed that someone had gotten out the wrong one.
I said we were going to start it next, Wiggins said. Before he told us we had to do the rest of it all over. It comes apart like, so we can each do part of it.
"Well spotted," Thomas said. "I polished that thing 2 or 3 times before I figured out it came apart." Carson hadn't told him that either.
I figured it had to,
Wiggins explained.
Otherwise, how would you do the bottom of the roof?
"Tongs," Thomas answered distractedly. "I suppose somebody has to go ask him which one he really means to use," he said reluctantly. He'd be happy to let Carson make his own mistake, but he knew Carson wasn't the one who'd have to deal with the consequences. "Otherwise, you're all going to waste the rest of the afternoon polishing that, and then Lang's going to be stuck with a real one." Bates asked,
Why are you so sure he doesn't want to use that one?
"Look at it," Thomas said. Bates looked at it, but did not appear enlightened. That was a shame, because Thomas had been hoping he'd volunteer to confront Carson on the subject. When Bates did not volunteer, Thomas went and knocked on the door to the butler's pantry. There was no answer, unless Ethel poking her head out of the servants' hall was an answer.
He's not here.
"Where is he?"
In the dining room with Mr. Branson, she said.
Fan-fucking-tastic. Thomas had managed to avoid the dining room since coming back to Downton. Not that there was any particular reason to avoid it, he just hadn't had any need to go in there. And now he did have a reason to go there. He found Branson walking around the table with one of the everyday silver trays, and Carson, naturally, criticizing the way he did it. "Sorry to interrupt," Thomas said.
Oh, yes, you are,
Carson noticed. "I was just checking how the lads are getting on with the silver," he said, and hesitated.
Yes.
As a footman, he wouldn't have dared question Carson's table-setting plan, no matter how obviously wrong it was. As ward-master of the convalescent home, it wasn't even remotely his business what Carson chose to put on the table. On the other hand, after coming all the way up here and, as Carson had pointed out, interrupting, he had to say something. "Couldn't help but notice the epigen," he said. "I wondered if the wrong one might have been brought down by mistake."
I fail to see how that is any concern of yours.
"Because you made it my concern, you fucking wanker! As I said, I do have plenty of work for my men to do. If you are not in fact using the George III epigen for the General's dinner, then that's just about done."
They are not.
said Carson.
Their work so far has been substandard. I doubt they'll be finished before dinner.
"You have them until tea time," Thomas reminded him. Carson had not, he noticed, given him an answer about the epigen. He was tempted to say that if his men polished it and it wasn't on the table for the General's dinner, there wasn't anything he could do was the problem. Instead, he said, "Manage their time as you like. I just thought that if there had been a mistake with the epigen, it would be better to catch it now."
Thank you, Thomas,
Carson said in obvious dismissal. Thomas gave up. Unfortunately, now that he involved himself in the riddle of the epigen, he had to go back downstairs and explain that he hadn't gotten a real answer.
So, what do you want us to do? Wiggins asked.
It was, Thomas reminded himself, just as fair Wiggins to ask him that, as it had been for him to ask Major Clarkson to settle the other thing. Start with the things I showed you on the other pieces, and then do as much of the epigen as you have time for, he decided. That is, he added to Lang and Bates, unless you have a better idea. They were the ones who'd be left holding the baby after tea time, after all. Bates looked over at Lang, who was polishing the handle of the sauce boat with far more focus than the task deserved. That's fine, Bates decided. Thomas had hoped to have time for a smoke before his walk round the house with Miss Hughes, but that plan was shot, so he fetched her. He managed to keep the talk focused on the task at hand until they got to the recreation room, where she said,
You know that Mr. Carson is only anxious that the General sees us looking our best.
Yes, Thomas said, examining a newly polished bookcase.
He doesn't like having all these strangers in the house and everything at sixes and sevens, she added.
I gathered. Thomas turned his attention to a globe and a brass stand. We ought to polish the fittings on that. She glanced at it.
I suppose it is due. Mr. Carson has never liked seeing things change, and that's a fact.
I'll ask the men on the night shift to do it, if they have time after they do the wheelchairs.
Thank you. If they don't manage it, I'll try to have one of the maids do it in the morning. I'm only saying that all of this is difficult for him.
Difficult. Thomas knew he ought to say something like, I'm sure it is, or I understand. What he wanted to say was something like, I have been watching people die for 3 years. I know what difficult is. He settled on, the war has been difficult for a lot of people.
Yes,
Miss Hughes conceded. By now they had worked their way around to the windows, freshly washed by Thomas's men.
but Ethel!
Thomas now noticed that the woman, who had been making rather a meal of tucking a tartan rug around a patient's legs out on the terrace, was Ethel. She jumped away.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Hughes, she said, hurrying inside. I didn't want Major Bryant to catch a chill. Very helpful, I'm sure,
Miss Hughes said icily. Thomas stepped out onto the terrace. Major, he said, are you comfortable now? If there's anything else you need, I'll send one of the orderlies over. No, he said. Quite comfortable, thank you. Very good, sir, Thomas said. If you do need anything else, please ask one of the medical staff. The housemaids are not trained in patient care, and they have their own duties to attend to. Of course, Sergeant. I didn't mean to get the girl in trouble. He picked up his newspaper in obvious dismissal, and Thomas, lacking any alternatives, went back inside. Sorry about that, he told Miss Hughes. I've spoken to Major Bryant more than once about bothering the maids, but as he's a major, there's only so much I could do.
Miss Hughes shook her head. Ethel does nothing to discourage him. The rest of the girls have the sense to keep their distance.
They finished the walk round without finding any major problems, and more importantly, without Miss Hughes bringing up Carson again. The next thing after that was checking on Miss Coulter in the laundry. He had asked her to have the linen finished early for the day, since the shelves looked so much neater when they were fully stocked. She had protested mightily before agreeing to do it, and Thomas had set aside a half hour to listen to it all again, but was pleasantly surprised when she reported that they were on schedule.
We'll hang the last of it in the airing room overnight and iron it first thing in the morning, she assured him.
Thomas thanked her and wandered back over to the house, wondering what to do with his unexpected free time. The next thing on his list was rescuing Griff and Wiggins from Carson's clutches, but he couldn't do that early. He'd promised them to Carson until tea time. He could go in and check how they were doing, but he really didn't want to. Or he could go up to his office and try to have a smoke, but what were the odds he'd make it the whole way there without finding something that needed his attention? He sat down on the crate by the door instead and lit a cigarette. It seemed like a long time since he'd sat there. And it seemed he wasn't the only one to notice. Daisy, coming out with a bowl of scraps, asked,
What are you doing out here?
Had a spare minute, he answered.
Wish I did, she groused, dumping the scraps into the bin. We're run off our feet with the General's dinner on top of everything else.
Typical, Thomas said. Daisy, putting the lie to her words, sat on the crate next to him.
And William, she added.
Thomas frowned. What about him?
He's coming tomorrow,
she said, her tone suggesting he should have already known this. Now that she mentioned it, Thomas vaguely remembered hearing that William planned to stop here at the end of his embarkation leave. That's just what we need. Of course I want to wish him well, Daisy went on. But what if he has something else in mind? Thomas suddenly remembered a similar conversation with Madge, or Anna Ben Maud, years ago when her boyfriend joined up. But he couldn't imagine William, of all people, expecting something like that. What do you mean? What if he proposes? Oh, yes, that, of course. She went on, Miss Patmore says I should just say yes, and then after the war's over I can change my mind, if I want to. But isn't that dishonest? Saying yes when I'm not sure I mean it? Now Thomas wished he'd gone to his office. Maybe, he said slowly, trying to buy himself some time to think of an answer that wasn't, he's probably going to die anyway, so does it matter when you tell him? You could just tell him that, he finally suggested, that you weren't sure. I mean, you wouldn't be saying no. He hadn't said no to Lieutenant Courtenay. We don't know how much longer the war's going to last, Thomas added, and it changes people. He can't be sure that what he wants now is what he'll want then, if he was even still alive to want anything. And neither can you, so just promise to be his friend and talk about the future when, if he's going to have one. When it comes. Daisy looked thoughtful. I could do that, couldn't I? Yeah. But there was one way, besides the obvious, that Daisy and William were different from him and Courtenay. Courtenay wasn't going to France. Unless you think that if he's killed, you'll regret not having said yes. She slumped. Oh, yeah. Thomas stood up, hoping she'd read it as a dismissal. There wasn't much further they could go on this subject before he had to think about Peter, and he wasn't going to do that right before a confrontation with Carson. Fortunately, Daisy stood up too. I should get back. Thank you. Thomas still had a few minutes left before tea time, so he wandered aimlessly around the courtyard for a bit, smoking a second cigarette. Inside, he found the 4 silver polishers facing a much diminished mountain of silver, and no Carson. He was in there a few minutes ago, Wiggins explained. He took away the things he was satisfied with. These all have to be done again, apparently. Griff added,
He said we were to come back down after our tea and keep walking.
You aren't doing that, Thomas said. Sorry, he added to Bates and Lang. Maybe he'll start being reasonable once I'm not involved.
Maybe,
said Bates dubiously.
I admit,
Bates said, sitting down next to Anna for tea.
I didn't know what I was getting myself in for agreeing to help with the silver.
A battle of wills between Thomas and Mr. Carson? She asked. That had seemed fairly obvious to her.
I knew it would be that,
Mr. Bates said.
But
he shook his head.
The worst of it is, Thomas was actually being reasonable.
Mr. Bates's expression was almost comically affronted. If he wanted to calm Mr. Carson down, he could have just done what he asked, she pointed out.
He really couldn't,
Mr. Bates said, shaking his head.
He's a sergeant now. If he lets himself be pushed around like that, he'll lose the respect of his men.
Mr. Carson and Miss Hughes came in then, and they all stood up. Once they were seated again, Mr. Bates continued.
That's the other big surprise. They do respect him, unlike him.
And I had to admit that was a bit of a surprise to her, too. But she hadn't forgotten what Thomas had said about Mr. Carson being, bad at managing people. She wouldn't put it past Thomas to have become good at it out of spite. Stand easy, Thomas said. Carter, make sure you keep your elbow up. You're saluting, not trying to keep the sun out of your eyes. Let's try it again, and this time we're all going to salute at the same time. Attention! They snapped to. Hut! They saluted, very nearly simultaneously, though Wiggins was a bit early and Palmer a bit late.
Thomas!
Carson came barreling around the path that led to the servants' entrance. Thomas noted which of the men managed to stay at attention despite this distraction, while also wondering if perhaps the house was on fire. But if it were, surely one of the nurses, who did take part in saluting drill, would come out to get them. Sergeant Barrow, he said, adding a quick, at ease, to the men. Mr. Carson, can this wait?
No, it cannot. Those men were to return and finish the job that they started.
Mr. Carson, I was very clear that they were at your disposal until tea time, Thomas said. Now, if you don't mind...
I beg your pardon, Thomas, but I do mind. The task assigned to them is not finished.
That, Thomas said deliberately, is not my concern. Charlie?
Carson actually gasped.
It was glorious, except that Thomas could have done without his entire section standing there watching. Now are you going to leave, or do I need to drill my men somewhere else?
I am the butler in this house,
Carson reminded him.
You have no right to tell me to leave.
That's right, I don't. Everyone else standing here, though, was a different story. He turned back to the men. Hup! All right, we haven't practiced this, but let's try form falls. They managed to get formed up with only a few missteps, and Thomas marched them around to the side of the house. He half feared, and maybe half hoped, that Carson would follow them, screaming like a fishwife, but he did not. They finished their saluting drill without incident and went inside to do dressing changes, where it became apparent that Carson had come up with a much better plan. Colonel Grantham was waiting in the front hall.
Sergeant, he said, could I have a word?
Yes, sir, Thomas said, because he had absolutely no choice in the matter. He sent his men on and followed the colonel into the small library. Carson was there, an expression of grave displeasure on his face. Splendid. Carson closed the door behind them, and Colonel Grantham said,
Carson tells me that you spoke to him disrespectfully.
That was unexpected. Thomas had figured it was going to be something about the silver. Now that all of his prepared responses were useless, he stalled for time by saying,
I'm sorry he feels that way, sir.
Carson made a sort of strangled noise. Colonel Grantham gave him a curious look.
I'm sure you understand that, even though you aren't working under Carson at the moment, you must still treat him with the respect due to his position in this household.
Yes, sir. Was it even worth trying to defend himself? Probably not. I'm sorry that he troubled you with this, but I have asked him several dozen times to call me Sergeant Barrow, at least in front of my men. Colonel Grantham looked at Carson again.
Why? What has he been calling you?
Thomas said. The colonel sighed.
Carson?
Yes, my lord.
Call him Sergeant Barrow.
Carson hesitated.
Yes, my lord.
Colonel Grantham turned back to Thomas.
Sergeant?
Yes, sir.
Call him Mr. Carson.
Yes, sir.
Thank you,
Colonel Grantham said with exaggerated patience.
Now, is there anything else?
Thomas was half tempted to ask him to also tell Carson not to interrupt when he was drilling the men. He had a feeling that Colonel Grantham would consider that offense a particularly outrageous one. But given the sarcasm dripping from the question, he decided he had better not. No, sir. Carson, evidently having made a similar calculation, echoed,
No, my lord.
Dismissed.
Thomas left with Carson hard on his heels. As soon as they were out of earshot, Carson said,
I don't know what you think you're playing at.
I'm not playing, Mr. Carson. I'm trying to do my job.
How dare you speak to his lordship that way?
Thomas stared at him, mentally reviewing everything he'd said in the last few minutes. There was really only one thing Carson could be talking about. You mean calling him sir?
What else could I mean?
You could mean anything, because you're out of your mind, Thomas did not say. He also did not say, I don't know if you've noticed, but we're both wearing the king's uniform. Nor, he was there too. Don't you think that if he objected, he'd have said so? I asked.
What?
When I first got back, I asked Mr. Bates to ask his lordship whether I should call him sir or my lord. I don't think he cares much either way, but I knew it would upset you if I got it wrong. So, Carson looked confused, or possibly dyspeptic. It was hard to tell with Carson. Is that all? He asked. He gave Carson a second or two to answer, and when he didn't, got back to work.
So what has been going on downstairs?
Robert asked as Bates laid out his evening clothes.
I gather Carson and Thomas, Sergeant Barrow, I should say, are at each other's throats.
Bates hesitated.
I don't like to bear tales, my lord.
No, of course not, but I had to settle one of their squabbles today.
He'd certainly formed the impression it was one of many, at any rate.
Which one?
Bates asked. That answered that question.
Apparently Thomas, Sergeant Barrow, called Carson Charlie.
Bates nodded.
I heard about that one, my lord.
He held out 2 pairs of cufflinks. Robert pointed to one.
Did they tell you what Thomas Barrow was doing at the time?
Something too outrageous for Carson to describe, apparently.
What?
Saluting drill,
Bates said. Robert turned his head to stare at him.
Really?
Bates nodded.
The men couldn't believe it. In the middle of a drill, he just comes up and starts scolding their sergeant.
Robert could hardly believe it either.
Are you certain?
He knew Carson wasn't a military man, but surely he'd understand that some things just weren't done.
I only had the story third hand,
Bates admitted.
One of the maids heard some of the men talking about it.
Perhaps there was a misunderstanding,
Robert said hopefully.
Perhaps.
Bates said, but he didn't sound as though he thought it likely. Thomas wished he was surprised to go down a bit before dinner and find Lang sitting at the servants' hall table polishing an Epperton. It was the palm motif mid-Victorian one, a much more reasonable choice for the occasion. Glancing up at Thomas, Lang muttered,
Mr. Carson has made some changes to the table setting plan.
Did he? No. Thomas picked up a polishing cloth and one of the little silver baskets that hung from the arms of the Epperton.
I'd never have guessed. You don't have to do that,
Lang said, nodding at the piece Thomas had started polishing.
I'm not doing anything else at the moment,
Thomas pointed out.
How much of what you did today is he actually using? The trays,
Lang said.
The soup tureen, one of the sauce boats, one pair of candlesticks.
The square ones with the lozenges, Thomas guessed.
How did you know?
I always hated polishing the ones with the vines. He wouldn't swear that Carson knew that. He might have just picked out the things that were the fiddliest to do.
I'm sorry you were caught in the middle of all that. It's all right,
Lang said. They had the Epperton nearly finished by the time Daisy and Miss Patmore started bringing the dinner in. O'Brien had been watching Thomas the whole time, a crafty look on her face, but waited until Mr. Carson and Miss Hughes had made their entrance to say,
I thought polishing silver was beneath you now, Thomas. I'm not sure where you got that idea,
Thomas said. He watched Carson out of the corner of his eye to see how that landed, but Carson didn't react and in fact seemed uncharacteristically subdued for the rest of the meal. Then, at the end of it, when he and Miss Hughes stood up to go, he cleared his throat and said,
Sergeant Barrow, if I could see you in my pantry, please.
Thomas briefly considered refusing, but suspected that if he did, he'd be accused of antagonizing him.
Certainly, Mr. Carson.
He went, but he sat, uninvited, in the chair across from Carson's desk, his posture deliberately casual. Carson stood behind his own chair for a moment and glowered. Then he cleared his throat. Then he sat down and cleared his throat some more. Thomas was starting to think about pointing out that he did have a few things he wanted to do before bedtime when Carson finally said,
His lordship informs me that I was remiss in interrupting when you were drilling the men.
Thomas had his doubts that remiss was the word Lord Grantham had chosen. Part of him desperately wanted to know what word he had used. Disrespectful? Insolent? Churlish? Each possibility was more thrilling than the last, but he considered the likely result of trying to drag it out of Carson and simply said,
I thought so too.
Carson glowered at him some more.
Well,
he said. After a very long wait, Thomas said,
Is that all?
Again, he waited for Carson to answer. When he didn't, he stood up.
You can tell his lordship that I appreciate his apology.
He left. It hadn't been an apology, of course, but he was very nearly certain that that was what Carson was meant to be doing. Seeing Thomas head out to the courtyard from Mr. Carson's pantry, Anna followed him. He was unsurprisingly sitting on a crate smoking a cigarette. Everything all right? Anna asked him. He nodded.
Just grand,
he said, settling onto the crate next to him. She said, It was nice of you to help Henry with the silver.
He hunched his shoulders and said sulkily, I can be nice.
I know you can, she pointed out. That's what I just said.
But he muttered something about not having to sound so surprised about it.
I'm sorry, who was that making a fuss about not polishing silver? She asked teasingly.
He gave her a sharp look. It wasn't about the silver.
No, she sighed. I suppose it wasn't. She'd seen this happen before, of course. They all had. Thomas got stroppy, and Mr. Carson put him in his place. But this time Thomas wasn't playing his part.
If he'd just show a bit of deference, Mr. Carson would stop and the whole thing would blow over. He just wants to remind you who's in charge, she said. Thomas opened his mouth and closed it again. He inhaled deeply on his cigarette and said, "Do we really want to argue about this now?" "Does everything have to be an argument with you?" she countered. He smoked some more. "Not everything, but this does, yeah." "No!" Thomas woke instantly as the blood-curdling scream echoed through the sleeping house. He grabbed his dressing gown and lit a candle before the echo died away, thinking muzzily that it must be one of the patients, a battle dream, and what was he doing sleeping on duty? But he wasn't on duty, and the source of the scream was much nearer than the wards, 3 floors away. More screams followed, and other doors were opening even as he stepped into the corridor. There was a commotion behind the door to the woman's side, and the electric lights came on. "What in heaven's name is happening?" someone asked. Miss Husey thought. "It's Lang," he said. "Battle dream. It happens." Carson elbowed past him and into Lang's room as Lang wailed, "No, I can't do it."
Henry,
Carson said.
you're having a bad dream. Wake up.
Lang went over to shake Lang, it looked like, and Thomas took a step into the room. Everyone else, including the women, crowded in behind him.
It's only a dream, Henry.
Carson said firmly.
Stop having your gun.
Lang, half awake, clutched at him. "Soldiers," he said. "They're soldiers, but I can't go back. No matter what, Mr. Carson, I can't go back." Carson looked around as though for someone to rescue him from this situation.
No one's asking you to, Henry.
Thomas turned to the rest of the crowd. "Clear out! It's not a free show." O'Brien, terrifying in mob-cap and nightgown, drew herself up, but Miss Hughes said, "I won't want to see them like this." She began ushering them out, saying something about give him some privacy. "Bates, you can stay," Thomas said. Setting the candle down, he went over to Lang and, catching Carson's eye, jerked his head toward the door. Carson drew himself up as well, but apparently realized that he was being told to do what he wanted to do anyway and made a swift exit. "You're all right, Lang," Thomas said, taking him by the arm. "Come over here and sit down." He put Lang into the room's single chair and, seeing that he'd sweated through his pajamas, reached toward Lang's dressing gown. Bates handed it to him. "You're all right," Thomas repeated, tossing it over him. "Just a dream." "Was it?" Lang asked, his eyes wide. "A dream? Oh, thank God." He slumped, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "Yeah," Thomas said, tossing the bedclothes back to air them a bit. "Pretty bad one, sounds like." "It was. I had to. The dinner, and I can't go back." "I know," Thomas said. Medical opinion, he knew, was divided on the subject of whether it did shell-shock patients any good to talk about battle dreams. Major Winthrop, the psychiatrist at the casualty clearing station, had been against it. Morbid self-indulgence, he called it. But some of the other blokes who wrote about it in the RAMC Journal said that talking about them robbed them of their power. Thomas didn't particularly want to hear about whatever horrors were in Lang's head, but that was neither here nor there. "You want to talk about it?" he asked reluctantly. Lang shook his head. "Thank God." "All right. Here." He got his cigarettes out of his dressing gown pocket and handed Lang one. Opening the window a little, he perched on the sill and lit one of his own. Begrudgingly, he held the case in Bates's general direction, but Bates waved it off. "Best not to try to get back to sleep right away," he explained, handing Lang the lighter. "It's the adrenaline. Takes some time to clear your system." "It does?" Lang asked, his hands shaking as he tried to light the cigarette. "Yeah," Thomas said, taking the lighter back from him and sparking it. "Makes you shake, too," he added, holding the flame-juiced Lang's cigarette. "And makes you taste blood. Or pennies. Some blokes say it tastes like pennies." With those 3 things, he had exhausted his knowledge about adrenaline. "By the time you've smoked that, you'll feel better." Obediently, Lang took a pull. "I don't remember that. From the CCS, he meant. "I learnt it later. MO back at the ambulance unit." Captain Allenby, of course. The same place he'd learned the importance of sleight of hand in modern medicine. He hadn't actually said that the cigarette would help, because it wouldn't. The time it took to smoke it was what mattered. But if Lang thought otherwise, that wouldn't hurt.
I didn't know that either,
Bates said. "They discovered it not long before the war," Thomas explained. "Adrenaline, I mean. In monkey kidneys, I think. But that might have been something else." Captain Allenby had told him about a lot of medical things, and he hadn't always paid much attention. They talked a bit more about nothing in particular, and by the time Lang had finished his cigarette, he wasn't a quick smoker, he pronounced himself ready to go back to sleep. Thomas nodded and said, "You should be all right now, but you can come and get me if you need to." They left, Thomas just remembering to collect his candle on the way out. A good thing, since someone had turned out the electric lights in the corridor. Bates, standing outside the door to his own room, hesitated.
What?
He shook his head. "My job," Thomas said, and went back to bed. Lang made it through the rest of the night without waking them all up with screaming again, but at breakfast he was noticeably pale and shaky. The way that everyone was conspicuously not looking at him probably didn't help. But apart from asking if he was all right, to which Lang replied the most unconvincing "Yes, thank you," that Thomas had ever heard, he didn't know what else to do, so he turned his attention to the final preparations for the general's visit, and the regular work of the convalescent home, of course, which didn't stop just because a general was coming to dinner. Thankfully, and in contrast to the previous day, Carson made himself scarce, at least where Thomas and his men were concerned. Thomas managed to get for breakfast at the time of the general's arrival, just after tea, without seeing him. Shortly before the general was due to arrive, Thomas went through the house, rounding up the orderlies and nurses, apart from the 3 who'd been assigned to stay inside with the patients, and sending them outside. When he joined them, though, he urgently wished that he had delegated that task to someone else, because Thomas's men were lined up, neat as you please, on the opposite side of the drive from where Thomas had wanted them. "What are you doing on this side?" Thomas hissed to Wiggins. The expected answer came. "Mr. Carson told us to stand over here." Of course he fucking well had. Major Clarkson and the family hadn't arrived yet, and they still had a minute or two before the general was due, so Thomas hurried over to Carson, who was lined up with the rest of the servants across from Thomas's men. "We need to switch sides."
I beg your pardon?"
Carson asked. "My men need to be on this side," Thomas explained quickly. "If we're on that side, the way the car's coming, we have to salute with our left hands." Carson stared at him. Christ, was he going to make him say it? "My left arm doesn't go that high!" Carson opened his mouth to say something, but what it would have been, Thomas didn't know. The family were arriving and taking their places in front of the door. Thomas might still have considered an undignified scramble for position. The family were watching, but none of them was a general, if he hadn't caught the sound of cart tires crunching up the graveled drive. For lack of any better option, Thomas put himself just off Colonel Grantham's right shoulder between him and Carson. The 2 officers, standing in the center of the lineup, would salute with their right hands, so it wouldn't look too out of place if Thomas did too. Unfortunately, they'd practiced saluting on the command "hut" instead of "eyes left." The shorter command made it easier to get them all doing it at once. And now that the car was coming into view, there was no way to remind them that they were supposed to use their left hands. The car neared, and Thomas shouted, "Hut!" louder than he would have otherwise and hoped for the best. Standing at attention, he couldn't quite see what they were doing, except that there was too much sound and movement for it to be going smoothly. As the car neared them, Thomas looked out of the corner of his eye and saw that about half of the men were saluting, correctly, with their left hands, the others as they had practiced with their right. One switched while Thomas was watching. At last the car passed. "Hut!" he shouted again. The men stood at attention. At least that part went well, and Carson turned his head to glower at Thomas. The next bit was easy. They just had to stand there like waxworks while the general got out of the car and the officers exchanged salutes, and the visitors were introduced to the ladies. No one messed that up, and it gave Thomas plenty of time to think about how he wished he were dead. The business finished, the officers and family started going inside. Captain Crawley lingered talking to Mary, and perforce Thomas lingered too. As NCO, he was supposed to bring up the rear in this position.
"Crawley!"
the general bellowed. Matthew hurried in, and Thomas followed. Fortunately, the tour party hadn't gotten far. They'd planned to linger in the main hall for a bit, Lady Grantham talking about the house and their decision to offer it as a convalescent home to give the nurses and orderlies time to duck in via the side door. In each ward, there were to be 2 or 3 doing various medical things. Here a nurse making a bed, there an orderly taking someone's temperature and pulse, and so on. All for show, of course. The only thing that would normally be done at this time of day was dressing changes. Those they had done a couple of hours early, except for Captain Smiley, who no longer needed a dressing on the stump of his left arm, but had gamely agreed to play opposite Nurse Crawley in the changing a dressing sketch, as it was out of the question for the general to be shown a wound that was bleeding or oozing. That was one of two star turns in their little production, the other being physical therapy. There, Nurse Bellamy would encourage Captain Ames as he walked using the handrails. Similarly to Captain Smiley, he had progressed beyond that exercise in his real physical therapy some time ago, but was reprising the role because the person playing the patient had to be fit enough to stand there and wait for his cue. It was a good thing they hadn't tried to time the thing out to the minute because the general didn't know the script and kept wandering off to talk to various patients. Thomas had coached the nurses and orderlies on what to say if this occurred, mostly descriptions of the work they were demonstrating, but the patients had to ad-lib. Thomas only hoped that they weren't saying anything too damaging. He did notice a few officers he knew had survived the Somme, rapidly but discreetly leaving the room when the general entered it. Thomas was mostly glad that they were too well bred to make a scene, but a small part of him wished that someone would stand up and say that the man they were all making a fuss over had orchestrated the death of thousands. No one did, of course. In fact, the rest of the show went off without a hitch. And since Thomas had a few lines in the production, and most of the ones he did have were, "Yes, sir," he had plenty of time to stew about what Carson would have to say about the foul-up at the beginning. Something scathing, of course, probably involving the honor of the house, and perhaps an accusation that Thomas had sabotaged the thing on purpose. Never mind that Carson deserved at least as much of the blame as he did. It was perfectly reasonable for him to have assumed that the men would stand where they always stood and the women opposite, rather than the household staff to one side and the convalescent home people opposite. He might even say so when Carson got started. It wasn't until about halfway through the tour that it occurred to him that his men were probably wondering what he was going to have to say about it. As much as Thomas wished he could just pretend the whole humiliating incident hadn't happened, he was going to have to say something. He couldn't just leave them waiting for the hammer to fall. But what was he supposed to say about it? Having just spent so much time imagining what Carson would say, he wondered if he could use some of that. "I beg your pardon," he could say. "I thought I was dealing with trained soldiers. I had no idea that saluting would be too much for you. As I was mistaken, we'll have an hour of saluting drill every morning from now until doomsday." No, he wasn't going to do what Carson would do. In fact, he'd come closer to the mark by doing the opposite of what Carson would do. By the time the tour ended, Thomas had the beginnings of a plan. The officers and ladies went to change for the dinner party, and Thomas summoned his men to the orderly's room come wardmaster's office. Tossing his cap onto the desk, Thomas said, "Well, that first bit was kind of a shit show, but the rest was all right." That was part one of Not Carson. Carson never said anything about the parts you got right. "Everybody was where they were supposed to be, uniforms in good nick, wards tidy, all that." Possibly the reason Carson never did that was that it felt kind of stupid listing the ways you'd managed not to fuck up. He moved on. "I could have done without the bit where we all look like we forgot how saluting works, but at least nobody died." Now the second thing Carson would never say. "Mr. Carson and I didn't sort out in advance who was going to stand where, and we should have." That was even harder to say than he'd thought, but the roof didn't fall in or anything. "Now, as you know, we have to do it all over again when the general leaves, and I'd like to get it right on the second try." There was a murmur of agreement. "I'd also like a smoke, so we'll take a 10-minute break before we form out front for saluting drill. Dismissed." Thomas had been prepared for some protest. This time of day was normally quiet, and after all the extra work they'd put in preparing for the general's visit, they could have reasonably expected to be left to their own devices. But they just started reaching for cigarettes and jostling for places to sit. It would have been tempting fate to leave them with no opportunity to grouse behind his back, though, so Thomas left them in possession of the room and nipped out front for his own cigarette break. While he smoked it, he indulged in improbable, but highly satisfying, speculation about what might happen if he went on the offensive instead of waiting for Carson to say something about the general's arrival. What if he accused Carson of fouling it up deliberately to make Thomas and his men look bad? Thomas could point out, truthfully, that since Carson had interrupted their drill, he knew perfectly well which side of the door they were planning to stand on. It might even be a sore spot to poke, since his lordship had apparently had words with Carson about the interruption. Carson might attempt to defend himself. How many times had Thomas attempted the same? By saying that he hadn't known where they stood made any difference. It might even be true. But then Thomas could say, the perfect retort came easily. Your abysmal ignorance of the most minor points of military etiquette is no excuse. He couldn't quite remember what he had done to prompt Carson to say that to him. Minus the word military, of course. It might have been the time he'd announced a Viscount's younger son as Lord rather than the Honorable. What a shame there is no one in this house whom you might have consulted. There, he could look pointedly at Lang, or perhaps even Bates. He could even slam his drill manual down in front of Carson the way Carson had slammed Debrett's in front of him. Except that he might not get it back, and it was the one the wardmaster had given to him, so he didn't want to lose it. Also, he'd look like he'd lost his mind. Carson was the only one in the house who could get away with those kind of histrionics. Downstairs, at least. When the men came out, Thomas put those thoughts aside and focused on running drill. Now that they all knew which hand they were supposed to be using, it didn't take long to get it right. After dismissing the men, Thomas did another walk through the wards, the real one this time, checking on the patients and making sure that nothing of substance had been set aside while they were busy putting on a show for the general. Coming down the back stairs after checking the second floor rooms, he saw Carson frog marching Branson, trailed by Lang and Anna, the latter carrying a soup tureen on a tray. It was the tureen that piqued Thomas's interest. It wasn't much of a surprise. If Branson had planned something, Thomas imagined something in the line of an impassioned speech about Ireland, or the draft, or God knew what, and naturally Carson would have hustled him out of the dining room the moment he opened his mouth. But why wouldn't Ang and Lana have stayed to serve the soup? It wasn't, of course, any of his business, but he could always claim he thought they might need another more or less able-bodied man to deal with whatever was happening. He followed. At the bottom of the stairs, Branson protested.
All right, there's no need to be so rough.
Thomas was inclined to agree. Carson was now twisting Branson's arm up behind his back, but Carson exploded.
That's indeed to stop a murder.
By now, momentum had carried them into the kitchen. Though why Carson thought that was a good place to take a murderer, Thomas had no idea. Personally, he'd have chosen the scullery. Fewer potential weapons. But Branson, looking genuinely shocked, said,
Murder? What do you mean murder?
Anna shrieked, "You were going to assassinate the general!" Before Thomas had time to consider whether or not he wished Branson had succeeded, Branson denied it again and sulkily explained his real plan: to douse the hero of the psalm in a mixture of oil, ink, sour milk, and gallblatt.
He'd have needed a bath right enough, but not a coffin.
Now that Thomas wouldn't have minded seeing, except,
who do you think was going to get stuck cleaning it up?
He asked scathingly. Idiot! The general would have the stink washed off in 10 minutes, but the maids and the general's batman would be dealing with it all night at least. Carson took a moment's breath from glaring at Branson and took a withering look on Thomas. Whatever he might have said was interrupted by Daisy rushing in with a large cooking pot which evidently contained the actual soup. And as quick as that, the topic turned from murder, or at least vandalism, or assault, or whatever you'd call what Branson had been planning to do, to the question of how they were going to serve the soup. The answer to the first part of that weighty problem came from Miss Hughes, who banged down a slightly more presentable cooking pot with a surprising, "It's not been heated, but to hell with that!" Before Thomas could fully appreciate this unprecedented development in the housekeeper's vocabulary, William appeared from God knows where and said, "Also, Mr. Carson, I don't mind." As everyone turned to him with expression of surprise and gratitude, the revolting suck-up continued, "Who knows but I'll have the chance again?" After a moment of stunned silence, Carson said,
Would you? Would you really?
As they all bustled about finding William some gloves and getting the soup onto a tray, Thomas asked Anna, "When did he turn up?"
"A little while ago," she said. "I'm sure you could help too if you wanted."
"I really couldn't," he answered. By now, everyone else seemed to have forgotten about Branson, who was standing on the opposite end of the kitchen, looking confused by the turn things had taken. If he had any sense, he'd take advantage of the general preoccupation with the dinner party to make a run for it. But everything about his plan demonstrated that he didn't have any sense. Skirting around the edge of the crowd, Thomas made his way over to him.
What in hell were you thinking?
He asked in a harsh whisper. Branson must have been waiting to be asked about his motivation because he burst out with,
I was thinking that the general isn't a competent butcher. He doesn't deserve to be. I don't care,
Thomas interrupted. What was the point? What did you think was going to happen?
You'd see that not everyone is willing to bow down and kiss his.
Branson glanced at the women.
Feet. Not everyone forgets what he did at the Somme. He deserves to know. Come off it! If 400,000 casualties weren't enough to make him sit up and take notice, why do you think a bucket of slop would?
That set Branson back on his heels, but only for a moment.
For one thing, the bucket of slop would have happened to him, not someone else.
Not a bad point, but as Thomas had pointed out earlier, it wasn't the general who'd be stuck dealing with the consequences.
And in 5 minutes, he'd have washed it off. You didn't even think to nick his only uniform first, did you? What other uniform?
Branson asked.
Christ. They changed it into mess kit for the dinner, he explained. All he has to do is have a wash and put his regular uniform back on, and the rest of it is some enlisted man's problem, just like everything else he's ever done.
I didn't think about that, Branson admitted.
Obviously,
Thomas shook his head in disgust.
If you'd even poured the actual soup on him, you could have pretended it was an accident.
I didn't want to pretend it was an accident, Branson declared.
I wanted to teach him a lesson. Yeah? Well, you can't.
By now, Carson, William, and Lang had gone up with the soup. Miss Hughes came over to them.
Thank you, Sergeant, she said crisply. I'll take charge of Mr. Branson from here.
As she began outlining her objections, rather different from Thomas's, to Branson's plan, Thomas wandered off into the servants' hall where everyone not involved in cooking or serving the dinner was discussing the incident. Most of them knew nothing more than what had happened in the kitchen in full view of everyone, but Anna was quietly explaining something to Mr. Bates and didn't stop when Thomas sat down.
It said, forgive me, and then something about how they'll have arrested him by now, but he wasn't sorry because the general had it coming, she said. I don't know what I thought he meant he was going to kill him. I didn't have a lot of time to think about it.
Maybe because assassination would have been, in a way, a less monumentally stupid plan than the one Branson had come up with.
Thank God you found it in time to stop it,
Bates said.
Even if it wasn't murder he had in mind, he'd be in a lot more trouble if he'd managed to do the deed.
He's in enough trouble now, I should think,
Anna agreed. With a glance at Thomas, she added,
and pouring that stuff down the drain was bad enough. I'd not have liked having to scrub it out of the dining room carpet.
On the table linens, Thomas added, and it would probably have splashed on at least the people to either side of him, to say nothing of what the general's batman would have to deal with. He paused. It's going to be bad enough without him getting covered in slop.
Anna tried to stifle a giggle. Her expression turned serious.
She said, Thomas, you didn't know anything about... Did you?
No, Thomas said quickly. Maybe a little too quickly. She was now looking at Ed with more genuine suspicion than before.
I wondered if he was up to something when he offered to wait at table, he admitted, but I only figured on him giving the general a piece of his mind. If I'd known what he really had planned, I'd have told him how stupid it was.
And informed Mr. Carson?
Anna asked.
Thomas hesitated. Probably, he hurried on, but I didn't know anything the rest of you didn't. It's not my fault if Carson didn't think to ask questions when a bloke who doesn't think the revolutionaries in Russia went far enough suddenly took it into his head to wait at table.
Bates shook his head.
When you put it that way.
He should have been happy with Lang, Thomas added. He might have got a thing or two wrong, but nothing like that.
A little while later, Thomas had cause to regret his words. They'd shifted from talking about Branson's aborted act of protest to the general's visit more broadly, and Thomas was attempting to explain to Anna what had gone wrong with their salutes when William came barreling down the stairs.
Thomas, he said, there's Henry in the dining room.
Thomas ran upstairs, Anna hard on his heels. Passing through the servery and into the dining room, he found Lang weeping on the floor, clutching a tray with new potatoes and peas, presumably the former contents of the tray, scattered around him. Carson stood not far away, frozen in apparent shock, while Colonel Grantham, of all people, crouched on the floor next to Lang. Major Clarkson and Nurse Crawley hovered behind him as though aware that they ought to be doing something, but unsure precisely what it was. The rest of the party sat at the table, visibly attempting to convey through posture and facial expressions that if anything out of the ordinary was happening, they were entirely unaware of it.
Don't have to go back with them, do I?
Lang was saying. He reached up with one hand to grasp Colonel Grantham's mess jacket.
Because I can't.
He sobbed.
No, Colonel Grantham said. No, you don't.
He glanced up at Thomas.
Come on, old chap,
he said, starting to stand up, hauling Lang with him.
It's all right, Lang,
Thomas said, taking his free arm.
Let's just,
do what exactly?
Go with Sergeant Barrow,
Colonel Grantham said, prying Lang's fingers off his lapel.
He'll look after you.
Lang made a final gasping sob and seemed to come to some awareness of where he was.
Sir,
his eyes darted around frantically.
My lord,
Yes, Grantham said. It's all right. Sergeant?
Yes, sir,
Thomas said.
Come on, Lang.
He tugged at Lang's arm and at last got him moving toward the servery. Behind him he could hear Carson apologizing for the delay in serving the next course. Downstairs, Thomas realized, they'd all be trying to figure out how to salvage the dinner, which was the last thing Thomas cared about, and anyone not involved in that would want to gawk. He led Lang toward his office instead. Likely some of the men would be there, but unlike the downstairs crowd, they'd bugger off if he told them to. In fact, he didn't even have to tell them. They all stood up when they saw him, but Wiggins proved he knew not to take a joke too far by taking in Lang's evident distress and saying,
Anything you want us to do, Sarge?
Yes, Thomas said. Check the wards, would you? You never know if you might want to walk round again.
No one commented on how highly unlikely that was. They all just cleared out quickly while Thomas got Lang settled into one of the armchairs in his office area. Opening the bottom drawer of his desk, he took out a bottle of not very good brandy and some glasses. It hadn't seemed like a wardmaster's office without them. And poured some drinks.
Here,
he said, handing one to Lang.
Steady your nerves.
Obediently, Lang drank. Thomas seated himself in the other armchair and followed suit.
So, what happened? I don't know,
Lang said.
I don't have to go back, do I? No. Right.
He nodded.
Right. It was that boy they were talking about. William, going to join his regiment tomorrow. I knew that, but I just started to wonder if I'd got it wrong somehow. And then I couldn't stop thinking about it.
Thomas made an encouraging sort of noise. He could see how that could happen. Like how when O'Brien had suggested the wardmaster sent him to the front to get rid of him, he couldn't quite be sure it wasn't true, even though he knew it wasn't.
And I kept seeing him, out of the corner of my eye.
Lang went on.
The uniform. I could smell the trenches. I heard the shells. They were getting closer, and I had to tell the boy to get down. He was going to get his head blown off, standing up straight like he was on a parade ground.
He stared off into nothing.
No livery so handsome as a uniform. That's what the general said. I've had that nightmare, Thomas said. The one where you're in the dining room, but it's the front too, only no one else notices.
Once there had been eyes and fingers and ears bobbing in the soup, and no one else noticed that either. Looking at him bleakly, Lang said,
I don't suppose you've ever had it when you were awake. No,
Thomas admitted.
That'd be worse.
Lang took another slug of his drink.
I should go back. You're not going anywhere. You're not going back,
Thomas reminded him.
Lang shook his head. I can't stay here. Not after this. Mr. Carson would never.
Carson was going to have an absolute fit. He had that much right. And in Lang's shoes, Thomas would have rather gone back to the front than face him. But at the same time, he hated the thought of Lang leaving without a fight.
Do you want to stay?
He asked.
It doesn't matter what I want,
Lang said.
I can't. But I have to earn.
Nobody you can stay with for a bit? Thomas asked carefully, knowing how he'd hate having to answer the same question.
Family? A sister.
He shook his head.
I'd go in the workhouse before I'd inflict this on her and the kiddies.
Thomas tried to think of another solution. I'd talk to Major Clarkson about whether there's something you can do in the hospital, but I don't think that would do you much good at being war work. Lang shuddered.
No, that would be worse.
He took a shuddering breath.
It's impossible. Everything's just impossible.
Under his words, Thomas heard blood dripping on the floor and saw the dark puddle spreading beneath Courtenay's bed. We'll think of something. Carson, if he's furious enough at Branson, he might blame him for the whole thing. I mean, it kind of helped. All the excitement. No, Lang admitted. But I'm sure he didn't mean to. No, but he didn't give half a thought to how his little stunt was going to affect anyone else, Thomas answered. I'm not too pleased with him either. So if somebody's got to be hung out to dry for where I'm standing, it might as well be him. Lang laughed. Maybe. Do you think it'll work? Thomas hesitated. This just might, he thought, be the time for a comforting lie, just to get Lang through the night. But he couldn't quite manage it. It might. Coming downstairs with a dustpan full of vegetables, she'd had little choice but to clean up the worst of the spill while the guests were at least somewhat distracted with the main course. Anna heard Mr. Carson demand,
And what has Thomas run off to?
His voice was coming from the kitchen, which unfortunately was where she had to go to deposit the vegetables in the scrap bin. Entering, she found that he was addressing Miss Hughes and Miss Patmore, the latter of whom said, How would I know? Isn't he looking after Henry? Miss Hughes asked. Mr. Carson scoffed.
I suppose he is.
Anna almost wondered what he thought Thomas ought to be doing, except that she had a feeling she knew. Mr. Carson, would you like me to help us out with salad course?
I would not.
Turning to Miss Patmore, he barked,
We'll serve it in 10 minutes.
And swept out. Miss Patmore shoved a head of lettuce in Daisy's direction, saying, Who's that quick? She told Daisy, We'll put the celery Victor on a bed of lettuce. Make it look like more, since they only had about 5 peas apiece, with the roast. From what Anna had seen while clearing up, the vegetable situation hadn't been quite that dire. Miss Patmore always had some of each dish left in the kitchen after it was taken up. But she didn't argue. While Miss Patmore and Daisy sorted out the salad, Miss Hughes asked Anna, What did happen? All I could get out of Mr. Carson was that Henry had brought disgrace upon our heads. Anna hesitated. I'm not sure. He had some sort of episode with his nerves. He spilled the vegetables and, well... Has he gone mad then? Daisy asked, turning away from her lettuce washing. He was very distraught, Anna temporized. Thomas is looking after him, she added. At least he took him somewhere. Thank heavens for that, Miss Hughes said. Poor man, she added. I suppose having all these soldiers in the house is too much for him. Anna nodded. I wondered if he might reconsider the gardening job. Miss Hughes looked puzzled, and Anna realized that she might not have heard about that. It was something Thomas suggested when we had the dinner for Mr. Matthew and Mr. Carson had his heart trouble, she explained. He said that outdoor work is supposed to be good for shell-shock cases, and that perhaps Henry could help pass it for a while, and then try being a footman again once he'd recovered a bit more. A thoughtful look on her face, Miss Hughes said, I won't ask why Thomas thinks it his place to hire undergardeners. It does seem more humane than Mr. Carson's going to sack him, then. In a way, it was the obvious and inevitable outcome to a scene like the one that had transpired in the dining room. In another way, it seemed unspeakably heartless. Miss Hughes shook her head slightly. If he isn't well enough to work, she pressed her lips together. I don't like it either, but his lordship has already done more than he had to giving him a chance, and then a second chance after the last time. Anna couldn't argue with that either. About the time that Thomas convinced Lang to take a powder and go up to bed, with the unconvincing claim that things might look better in the morning, the night shift turned up, and before he could get more than halfway through briefing them, Griff stuck his head in and said,
Sarge, the housekeeper said to tell you to have it at port, and the general says you won't have time to go through. Whatever that means.
It means he'll be leaving shortly, Thomas said. Usually the gentlemen rejoined the ladies in the drawing room for coffee after port and cigars in the dining room. Round everyone else up, would you? Griff agreed, and Thomas, as he ought to have done when the general arrived, went out front to forestall any more last-minute changes in the arrangements. About half of the men had already lined up by the time Carson led the procession of servants up from the kitchen door. Eyeing them, Carson said,
You have decided it's acceptable for them to stand there now.
Naturally, the 2 massive cock-ups that had occurred on Carson's watch hadn't led him to forget the one that happened on Thomas's. Ignoring the sarcasm dripping from Carson's voice, Thomas said, We've practiced it this way now. Best not change again. The general's farewell went off without a hitch. Thank God. But after the family had gone back inside, Carson rounded on Thomas and demanded,
Where were you?
"What?" Thomas asked, puzzled. He glanced over at his men, who were waiting for instructions.
I sent William for you,
he said.
and you disappeared.
It took Thomas a moment to understand what he was on about. You... He shook his head, letting out a huff of disbelief. "You know, I actually thought he came to get me for the medical emergency. But that wasn't it at all, was it?" He scoffed again. "Unbelievable!" With another shake of his head, he turned away from Carson and went over to the men. "Good work," he said. "For the most part. Hand over your cases to the night shift and you're free to go. Dismissed." They fell out, most of them heading for the side door. Wiggins lingered.
Is Lang all right?
Involuntarily, Thomas glanced over at Carson, who hadn't bothered to ask that question. Turning back to Wiggins, he said, "More or less. Thanks for asking." Wiggins nodded and hurried off after the others. By now the servants had started down the path to the kitchen door, but Thomas nipped inside the front door and headed up to the top of the house to check on Lang. Lang was in his bed, dead to the world, but not, Thomas checked his pulse, actually dead. An empty glass with a chalky film at the bottom suggested that he had taken the sleeping powder as directed. Good, he should be out all night, and Thomas didn't have to worry about him doing anything drastic. It had been a long day, and now that Thomas was within shouting distance of his bed, he was tempted to stay there. But he had to check on the night shift men at least once more, and besides, if he didn't go downstairs, it would look as though he was hiding. He wouldn't give Carson the satisfaction, but he did take his time with finding and briefing the night shift. By the time he got down to the servants' hall, the kitchen girls were laying the table for their dinner. William was there, telling the story of what had happened in the dining room to a rapt audience. Thomas sat down by Anna and Bates. "Branson gone already?" It seemed unlikely. Carson wouldn't have sent for the police until the general had gone. But if he was going to blame Branson for Lang's breakdown, he had to introduce the subject somehow.
Mr. Carson sent him back to his cottage to stew in his own juice,
Anna explained.
Now that was a surprise.
"They're not worried about him doing a runner?" They exchanged a glance.
I'm not sure what Mr. Carson has in mind,
Bates said, a little evasively, Thomas thought.
How's Henry?
Anna asked.
Should we take a tray up to him?
Thomas shook his head. "Gave him a sleeping powder. The excitement didn't do him any good. I don't suppose Branson thought of that either." William spoke up. "He were all right when we were serving the soup, though. Looking back, he might have been a bit off during the fish course, but it weren't until we took the joint up that he started carrying on." "Carrying on," Thomas repeated flatly. William at least had the grace to look sheepish. Acting like you weren't well, I mean." "He was thinking about how you're going to die, idiot." Thomas was tempted to say it out loud, but it didn't exactly fit with the version of events he was trying to put forward. Before Thomas could quite decide what to say next, Carson and Miss Hughes came in. They all stood up, and Carson left them standing while he shook his head sorrowfully and said,
What must the general think of this household?
Thomas bit back several replies on the theme of the general having seen and done worse, and eventually Carson sat down, allowing the rest of them to sit too. Once they had, William said, "What's going to happen with them, Mr. Carson? Branson and Henry, I mean." Carson opened his mouth, but Miss Hughes spoke first.
Henry didn't mean to cause a scene. He isn't well, but he's not a bad man.
Thomas stared at her. Why in God's name did it even need to be said that he wasn't a bad man?
Not at all,
Carson said magnanimously.
but he doesn't belong at Downton.
Nervous glances went around the table, but no one said anything until Thomas asked, "Why's that, Mr. Carson?" Carson turned a disbelieving look on him. "I'm just saying," Thomas said. "The last time someone was taken ill in the dining room—" "Nobody tried to sack you, you supercilious bastard!" Miss Hughes shot them a warning glare.
And what about Mr. Branson? She asked Carson. Does he belong at Downton?
As a change of subject, Thomas thought it was out of the frying pan and into the fire, but it might help him get around to the point he wanted to make. Carson said.
It's a delicate business. Would we really be writing to the police and cause a furor and bring riot down on our heads? And all because you wanted to pour a pot of slop over a man's head?
He shook his head with an almost fond smile, as if Branson were a child who'd played an impish trick. What? Thomas said blankly. That was twice now today that Carson had surprised him. He really shouldn't have been surprised that Carson cared more about the dinner party than about Lang, but that he'd shrug off a plot to cause mayhem in the dining room was genuinely baffling.
It didn't succeed after all,
Carson added indulgently.
thanks to Anna. I need not have had the opportunity to try if Lang were more reliable,
Now he looked straight at Thomas.
or if anyone else had stepped forward to wait at table.
Thomas's jaw dropped.
Oh, fuck you!
People gasped. Thomas ignored them.
Branson plans are crime! And you're blaming me! Me and Lang! Can you even hear yourself?
I beg your pardon?
Carson began.
No!
Thomas said, shaking his head quickly.
You're unpardonable! Lang is ill, and we...
What did he and Lang have in common? What was it that made Carson pick the two of them, one after the other, for his scapegoats?
Well, to begin with, I don't work for you!
And you never will again.
Carson vowed,
And why in God's name would I want to?
suspecting that the answer might have had something to do with him begging to come back here when he'd been facing poverty and ruin. Thomas hurried on.
And why would I step forward to help you save your precious dinner party? Why? Because I don't have anything better to do?
I thought
Carson snarled.
that you might possess a modicum of loyalty.
Because you've always been so kind to me,
Thomas demanded.
I despise you, Mr. Carson. I despise you because you're an arrogant, small-minded bully with an exaggerated sense of your own importance, and you're not even very good at your job.
Thomas could forgive a lot, but not that. Your real fucking job, the wardmaster had said, is to look out for your lads. Carson looked out for something. He was looking out for Branson, covering up his crime. Why? The answer, when he thought of it, was devastatingly simple. It was the same reason, really, that Thomas used to look down on people like Syl, because he couldn't stand that anyone might think he was the same as them. Lang's crime wasn't causing a scene, it was showing weakness. And what Branson had planned was stupid, but it wasn't weak. He went on, but most of all, I despise you because you despise anyone who isn't exactly like you. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Why this and everything else has to be my fault because I'm... He almost said it, but ran craven at the last moment. Not the same kind of man as you, and Lang, well, he's almost as bad. 2 years in hell, and he can't keep a stiff upper lip about it. I mean, he's practically a pansy, right?
Get out! Carson rose to his feet, his face purpling. Get out of this house right now or I'll...
Hit me again,
Thomas suggested.
try, please.
There was a gasp from the other side of the room, and some distant part of Thomas's mind noted that the people along the left side of the table were now looking at something else beyond Carson. But he'd worked up a head of steam now and rolled on.
I'd beat the living shit out of you right now, except you're not worth going to prison for.
Carson made a sort of lunge in his direction.
How dare you!
Have it, Miss Hughes said, her tone placating.
No,
Thomas answered.
do you even... Look, Lang was falling apart in front of him, and he sent William to come get me, a medic, to help him pass vegetables around to a dozen grown men and women with full use of all their limbs. Do the rest of you really think that's normal?
Thomas stopped talking, suddenly weary, and silence rang in his ears for a moment. Then everyone stood up, and a voice from the far corner of the room said, I don't. He looked toward the source of the voice and, oh, fuck my blind. Fortunately, he managed not to say it out loud.
Nurse Crawley,
He said, his voice sounding thin and distant to his own ears.
is there something I can help you with?
She stepped into the room, and Thomas noted distantly that she was out of uniform. He ought to have called her Lady Sybil. I came down to see if there was anything I could do for Branson or Henry, she said. Branson's fine, Thomas said automatically, his mind racing to try to figure out how much she'd heard. Thankfully not fuck you. That part had been early on. She might have heard the pansy part, probably the bit about beating the living shit out of Carson. Carson jumped in.
He's gone back to his cottage to rest, my lady. His illness wasn't serious.
Illness? Belatedly, Thomas realized that Carson would have had to have given some explanation for Branson's abrupt disappearance. Lang's resting as well. If Mr. Carson doesn't decide to wake him up, just sack him. I'm sure Lady Sybil said deliberately, "that Carson wouldn't sack someone for being ill. And Carson, you can't sack Sergeant Barrow either. He works for the convalescent home, not the house." If she'd heard Carson telling him to get out, she'd definitely heard the part where Thomas threatened to beat the living shit out of him. Scrambling to think of a plan, Thomas considered that he might quite possibly be able to buy her silence on the matter by promising his own silence on the details of Branson's illness, except that there were plenty of other witnesses to both things. Carson pressed his lips together, his nostrils flaring.
"My lady," he said, "I'm sorry that you witnessed this."
He huffed and shook his head, apparently unable to come up with a word.
Sergeant Barrow is overwrought. You needn't trouble yourself."
For half a second, Thomas thought that she might buy it. Then she said, "Did you really hit him?" Thomas was about to deny it and to remind everyone that what he'd said was that he wasn't going to beat the living shit out of Carson, when he realized that Lady Sybil, or it might have been Nurse Crawley after all, wasn't asking him. "Carson?" She added a hint of steel in her voice. Carson's eyebrows twitched.
"The details of that incident are not fit for your ears, my lady."
Thomas wasn't especially keen to have her hear it either. "It was a long time ago," he added. "I'm not sure why I brought it up, really." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Carson," she said, "I'm surprised at you." She opened her mouth to say something else, then closed it again. "Is it also true that you sent for Sergeant Barrow to help with the dinner while Henry was ill?"
"My lady,"
Carson said, and fell silent. "I see," she said, "but I'm keeping you all from your dinner. Sergeant, can we talk tomorrow?"
"Yes," Thomas said. "Nurse Crawley."
She left. Carson sat down again. Or maybe collapsed was the word for it. Everyone else sat down too, looking back and forth between him and Carson. Now that Thomas was the only one standing, everyone was looking at him. Perhaps he should apologize or tell Carson to go fuck himself. Again, either would probably have about the same effect. He was tempted to go and eat in the kitchen, but that would look too much like running away. Instead, he sat down. Under the table, Anna squeezed his arm. What that was supposed to mean, Thomas didn't know. Carson didn't seem to have any better idea of what to say or do next than Thomas did. After a lengthy and ominous silence, he finally began ladling out portions of stew. They weren't trusted to help themselves anymore since rationing came in, and handing them to the hall boy to take around. They ate in grim silence, like a game of Quaker meeting, until the Spirit of God moved Miss Hughes to speak. "Sergeant Barrow is right about one thing, at least," she said. "You can't blame him for the dinner going wrong."
"I don't wish to discuss it,"
Carson said. Thomas would have shut up at that point, but Miss Hughes pressed on. "Nor can you blame Henry for being ill. I'm surprised at you as well, that you would care more about the dinner at a time like that."
"My concern,"
Carson declared,
"was for the honor of this house. I won't apologize for that."
"It seems," Miss Hughes answered, "we have different ideas about what upholds the honor of this house." Carson turned an icy glare on Miss Hughes, for the first time in Thomas's memory.
"I never took you for a woman of low standards."
He pushed his chair back, saying,
"I've lost my appetite."
William got about halfway to standing up when Carson did, but sank back into his chair when he saw that no one else was getting up. Once he had gone, Miss Hughes cleared her throat and said, "While we're on the subject, Sergeant Barrow, I do not appreciate hearing language of that sort." If it had been Carson saying it, Thomas wasn't sure how he'd respond, but in the circumstances, he decided to save the argument for when someone brought up something he didn't regret saying. "Yes, Miss Hughes, I'm sorry." Then Thomas pushed stew around on his plate for a while, waiting for someone to say something about any of the other things he'd said. No one did. "Papa?" Sybil said. When she returned to the small library, he was standing by the cold fireplace, looking as troubled as she felt. He looked up and attempted a smile.
"Are they all right, then?"
She told him where she was going and why. Mamma and everyone else was busy talking about Cousin Matthew. "I think so. Can we talk?"
"Of course."
She glanced over at Mamma and the others. The small library was, well, small. Papa saw the problem.
Shall we go into my study?
Yes, let's, she agreed. She rarely ventured into Papa's study, at least not now that she wasn't a little girl anymore. He took Cousin Matthew in there sometimes to talk about the estate. It seemed a good place for a serious discussion. On the way there, she thought about which of the many subjects jostling for space in her brain she would bring up first. She settled on, Cousin wants to dismiss Henry because of what happened.
I thought he might,
Papa said, settling into the chair behind his desk. Will you let him? He rubbed his forehead.
I'm not sure Henry is well enough to work.
Does that matter? She challenged him.
Papa huffed. When we're discussing whether or not he keeps his job, yes.
I'm sure there's something he could do even if he isn't well enough to wait on important guests, she argued, remembering what Thomas had said about footmen being ornaments. When you chose an ornament, it didn't make sense to choose one that was broken. But Henry wasn't an ornament, he was a person.
There likely is, but he doesn't seem able to do the job we hired him for. Papa sighed. I'll speak to Carson. He may have some ideas.
Given what Sergeant Barrow had been saying as she went down the passage to the servants' hall, she doubted it. Carson doesn't want to help him. Did you know, when he sent William to fetch Thomas, he wanted him to help serve the dinner? Papa shook his head.
I'm sure that's not true.
It is, she insisted. She hesitated over how to describe what they had been doing. Quarreling about it when I went down. Oh, and Carson wants to dismiss Sergeant Barrow as well, even though he can't.
They've been quarreling for some time,
Papa said, echoing her pause. Carson doesn't like having the convalescent home here, Sybil stated baldly. He's never said anything to me, but the other girls have mentioned how he's always standing around disapproving of things.
I can't say I enjoy it either, Papa said, but we are, as General Strutt said, in the midst of a national crisis. I'll speak to him.
When the kitchen door opened, as Thomas was smoking a cigarette in the courtyard, he expected Daisy with one of her bowls of scraps, or perhaps Anna, delegated to talk some sense into him. Instead, it was Miss Hughes. She looked up at the clear sky, still not completely darkened, and said, Well, at least it's a fine evening. Thomas flicked ash from his cigarette. You didn't come out here to talk about the weather. No, she agreed and dove right into it. Mr. Carson doesn't mean to be heartless. He certainly doesn't mean not to be, she sighed. He doesn't like the way things are changing, and that's a fact. He's clinging to what he knows. Having you and William waiting at table, it was wrong to expect it of you in the circumstances, but he wanted it to be as it was before the war. Surely you can understand that. Thomas looked at her. The last time she'd tried to make excuses for Carson, he'd bitten back most of what he wanted to say. He wasn't going to do that now. If there is anyone in this house, he said levelly, who has suffered less from the war than Carson, I don't know who it could be. Certainly not me, or Lang. Well, no, she admitted, but I don't have time to indulge his fantasies about stopping the world in its tracks, Thomas went on. Even if I wanted to, which, to be frank, I don't. Do you want to know what I was doing when Carson was having a temper tantrum about the dinner party? He didn't wait for an answer. I was trying to figure out how to make sure Lang got through the night without killing himself. She gasped. Surely he wouldn't. I don't know. Lang hadn't said anything about it, after all. Neither had Courtenay. It was a feeling I had. I've seen it happen before, when people don't see a way forward. He shook his head. But that isn't even really the point. Nor would it do Lang any good to have Thomas going around saying he was suicidal. God only knew if Carson got wind of it, it would only make things worse. A footman killing himself in the house would be a scandal. Then what is the point? Miss Hughes asked. He isn't even my man, Thomas said. He's Carson's. But he could see that Miss Hughes didn't understand. How could he say it so that she would? In the dining room, Lang... He forgot where he was. That happens sometimes. He was there, and he was at the front, and he wasn't sure for a moment which one was real. It happens that way sometimes, he repeated. It must have been terrifying, Miss Hughes said uncertainly. Yes, Thomas said, but that isn't the point either. The point is that while that was happening, what Lang was trying to do,
What he cared about was making William get down. She wouldn't understand that either. It's in the trenches. If you stand up straight, the snipers can see you. Or the shells, if one hits nearby, you stay low and maybe the shrapnel will pass over you or at least hit you somewhere that isn't vital. William doesn't know that. The new men never do when they first come over. They have to learn it quick or they don't learn it at all. And that's what Lang was trying to do.
To save William's life, Miss Hughes said, because he thought they were in danger.
Exactly, Thomas agreed. He went to inhale from his cigarette and found that it had burned down to a long cylinder of ash. He tossed it down and lit another one. That's how it is over there. You have to look out for the bloke next to you, whether you know him or not, whether you like him or not. It's the only thing that matters. So Lang's half out of his mind, and that's still what matters. He didn't disgrace himself in there. No more than what's-his-name had, the one who'd shot himself in the foot to get his patrol to turn back. He did his job.
I think I understand, Miss Hughes said. But he wasn't really at the front.
Thomas shook his head. Doesn't matter. It's darkest at the front when anyone could die at any moment. But it's that way in the rear too. Even this far to the rear. You look out for your mates. You look out for the men under you. The man over you looks out for you. Lang was looking out for William. Who was looking out for Lang? Miss Hughes didn't answer. Who? Thomas repeated.
She pressed her lips together. I'm sure he appreciates your stepping in to help.
Which he do you mean? Carson? We know he doesn't, because he said so. Taking a drag from his cigarette, Thomas continued. It's a nightmare over there. It really is. You come back to Blighty, and it ought to be better. It ought to be safe. He hadn't thought about it quite that way before. It wasn't being shot at here, so why did it feel worse than France? Maybe I'm still halfway over there in my head too, because when I see how much Carson doesn't care about me, about Lang, about any of us, all I can think about is how he's going to get us all killed. Thomas hadn't allowed himself to think it before, but now that he'd put it into words, he knew it was true. He'd always resented Carson's bullying, his favoritism, the way he blamed other people, usually Thomas, for his own faults. But it didn't feel like an annoyance anymore. It felt dangerous. I know he isn't really going to get us killed, he added, because put that way it did sound a bit mad. But he can ruin people. Lang, me, Branson, except for some reason he doesn't want to. Perhaps he shouldn't have brought that up because Miss Hughes said,
It sounded as though you wanted him to ruin Branson.
Not particularly, Thomas said, if only because Nurse Crawley wouldn't like it. But if somebody's got to be held to blame, he's the one who made a choice. He shook his head. Oh, Carson, as though that would ever happen.
No, you're not being fair, Miss Hughes said. He couldn't have known what Branson had in mind, or that Lang would have difficulties.
He put a socialist hothead and a shell-shock case in a room with the butcher of the Somme, Thomas countered. How surprising is it that something went wrong?
Perhaps he might have seen it coming, she allowed. But what could he have done differently?
Automatically, Thomas began mentally listing the things Carson could have done, while also formulating an adenine reply. But since he'd been saying what he thought all evening, he might as well keep going. All right, he said. If I'd been in Carson's shoes, the first thing I'd have done was ask Lang if he thought he was up to it. If he said he wasn't, or wasn't sure, I'd start looking for help. Probably Mr. Mosley or Mr. Spratt.
But they're butlers, Miss Hughes objected. He couldn't ask them to play the footman.
But he could ask a chauffeur and an RAMC sergeant? Thomas asked rhetorically. No. If I couldn't find any other men, I'd work out a plan to use the maids for most of it. Maybe see what Bates can manage for the look of things. He couldn't carry the trays up the stairs, but you could put him in the servery and have him do a few little things. Sauces or the wine. I'd have to take him up there with some trays and things and experiment. He'd have had to experiment with what he could manage too, but Carson didn't have anything wrong with any of his limbs.
I didn't think of that, Miss Hughes admitted. I doubt Mr. Carson did either.
It wouldn't look right, having a man with a cane waiting at table, Thomas acknowledged. But if that's what I had to work with, I'd sort something out. I might talk about it a bit more with Lang, too, see if he thought he could manage a course or two, even if he didn't feel up to the whole three-ring circus.
The main course would be the trickiest thing for either Thomas or Bates. A joint of meat on a tray was a balancing act even with both hands. If Lang could handle it, the rest wouldn't be too bad. Apart from Thomas having to serve people from the wrong side, at least. He went on. Supposing Lang did think he was up to it, the first thing would be to show him I had confidence in him. I wouldn't, for instance, go around dropping hints that I thought he wasn't.
I expect he thought Henry would try harder to prove himself,
she suggested. That might have worked on me, Thomas admitted. But Lang's not me. Even with him, it might have backfired spectacularly, since if he really wasn't up to it, he'd never have admitted it with Carson needling him about it. No, if he said he was up to it, but I wasn't sure, I'd plan for it. Make sure the maids were ready to step in if I needed them. Come up with some excuses to get him out of the dining room if he started looking unsteady. That sort of thing. William said he started looking a bit off during the fish course, he added. I don't know if Carson didn't notice or didn't care, but Thomas wasn't sure he cared which it was. It was Carson's job to notice and to care. Both. Reluctantly, Miss Hughes said,
When they came down for the main course, Mr. Carson said something about not being sure Henry was up to the task.
Then I'd have had him take a break. Not the best time to lose the only able-bodied man I have, but there's no way round it. Shrugging his good shoulder, Thomas went on. We've talked, Lang and me, about what happens when he has his troubles. If things get muddled, if he loses track of what he's supposed to be doing, it reminds him of when he had his breakdown in the front. So I'd make sure he knew the plan backwards and forwards. Maybe even rehearse it. Work out some signals so that if he started to lose the thread, I could get him back on course before he had time to get too worked up. He tossed down his cigarette. That's what I would have done. He'd also have made sure not to pick a fight with anyone else and stick Lang in the middle of it, but mentioning that would only prompt Miss Hughes to object to his characterizing what Carson had done over the silver as picking a fight with it.
I see,
Miss Hughes said. Thomas braced himself for a but, followed by an excuse for why Carson couldn't have done that. What she said instead surprised him.
Well then, I suppose it's a shame you weren't in charge of the dinner party.
I had other things to do, Thomas reminded her. Speaking of which, I'd best check on my men and on Lang and get to bed.
Of course, she said, standing up. I won't keep you.
I heard things were eventful downstairs,
Robert prompted when Bates turned up in his dressing room to get him out of his mess kit.
Bates said.
There's one bit of good news, my lord. William and Daisy are engaged.
Oh,
Robert said, trying to remember which one Daisy was. A kitchen maid, he thought.
Please give him my congratulations if I don't see him before he leaves.
With that development, it was an especially good thing that he decided to arrange for William to be Matthew's Batman.
I'm sure he'll appreciate that, my lord,
Bates said, taking off Robert's mess jacket with an expectant air.
To begin with, how is Henry?
Sergeant Barrow says he's doing well enough,
Bates said.
He sent him to bed with a sleeping powder. I expect a night's sleep will do him good.
Lady Sybil tells me Carson wants to dismiss him.
Robert still wasn't sure if Sybil might have got that wrong.
That's what he said, my lord.
Lady Sybil objects, Robert told him. I can't say I particularly like it either, but she didn't think Carson would be inclined to look for another solution.
It doesn't seem likely,
Bates agreed.
Sergeant Barrow did have an idea about that a while back.
Where does Sergeant Barrow come into it?
Robert wondered aloud.
Never mind, what's his idea?
The last time that it seemed Henry might not be well enough to wait at table, he suggested he work in the garden for a while until he felt up to trying again as a footman.
Bates explained.
Apparently working outdoors is supposed to be good for shock. I can't say I know Mr. Bassett well, but he might be a bit more patient than Mr. Carson with Henry's difficulties.
Bassett did indeed protest frequently that he was unable to keep the gardens up to standards with no assistance.
I see.
Henry didn't think much of the idea then,
Bates added.
It's a bit of a step down working outdoors, but he might feel differently now.
I'll speak to Bassett, Robert decided. That may be the answer we're looking for.
It would appease Sybil, at least, even if Henry didn't take them up on it.
If Henry feels he can find a situation more to his liking elsewhere, of course we'll wish him well and send him off with a suitable reference.
Very good, my lord.
That was one item off his list.
Lady Sybil also tells me that Carson and Barrow quarrelled.
Bates shot him a look of mild disapproval, and Robert added,
Yes, I know it isn't really cricket asking you to bear tales, but I'm going to have to speak to both of them. I doubt that they'll describe the incident in the same way.
I expect not, my lord, Bates admitted. Sergeant Barrow used some language that he oughtn't to have. Lady Sybil missed the worst of it, thankfully. Apart from that, most of what he said was inflammatory, but not untrue.
Robert sighed. I seem to remember, he noted, that Barrow was chosen for the convalescent home job because he'd be able to work with the household staff.
To be fair, my lord, neither Miss Hughes, Miss Patmore, nor Miss Coulter in the laundry has had any difficulty with him, nor any of the junior staff. It's only Mr. Carson who's having trouble.
He hesitated.
And if he were pushed out, his men won't like it.
Robert vaguely remembered hearing one or two of Barrow's men saying complimentary things about him at some point.
Is he that popular?
I could scarcely believe it either, my lord, but yes. And they already resent the way Mr. Carson treats him and them. If they learnt that he was behind the removal of their sergeant, well, it would be a substantial problem for the next man to deal with.
Robert didn't need to be told that it was highly unlikely that the reason behind such a change could be kept from the men.
Her ladyship and Major Clarkson are quite pleased with him as well, he said. I don't think it's likely they'll want to remove him.
Nor would Sybil like it, for that matter.
If all of the senior servants found him difficult to work with, but are quite certain that don't.
Bates hesitated slightly.
I'm fairly sure. If Miss Patmore found him difficult, we don't know. You might ask Miss Hughes to be certain of her Miss Coulter, but I haven't heard of any trouble.
Carson and Barrow have never got it along, Robert said. I suppose it's to be expected they'd butt heads now they're on the same level.
Now Bates's hesitation was more noticeable.
Come out with it, old chap,
Robert chided him.
It's late.
Thomas Barrow, I should say, seems to be making quite an effort to get along with Mr. Carson. I won't say there hasn't been a point or two where he could have been a bit more conciliatory, but...
You're saying that the fault is mostly on Carson's side?
I was trying not to say that, my lord. But, yes, I don't believe he accepts that they are on the same level. He keeps trying to force Thomas to defer to him. I expect you've heard about the silver polishing.
Her ladyship mentioned it, Robert said. I don't quite understand why Carson wanted Barrow to do it in the first place.
To prove he could,
Bates said bluntly.
I'm sorry, my lord, but that's what it was.
It did seem more logical than what Cora had tried to explain about medical supplies in the silver safe and so on.
So by tonight, Barrow was fed up.
That's about the size of it, my lord.
Bates agreed. The next morning, Thomas tapped on Lang's door and let himself in. He found Lang sitting up on the edge of his bed in trousers and shirt sleeves. "All right?" Thomas asked. Lang made a non-committal sound.
I don't know what I'm going to do now.
"I'm going to demand breakfast on a tray in my office," Thomas said. It was a decision he'd made in the small hours of the night, thinking about how unprepared he'd be to face Carson and the rest of them when he'd barely slept. "Join me if you like."
Thanks,
Lang said.
but I was thinking a little further ahead than breakfast.
"I figured." But he didn't know what the day was going to bring for either of them. "But breakfast is the next thing. Might as well get through that." With a bit more chivying, Lang did up his tie and put on his jacket. Thomas installed him in the orderly's room before continuing down to the kitchen, where William was mooning about, cluttering the place up. "Daisy, I'll need mine and Lang's breakfast on a tray. We're having it in my office." She looked at him. "What?" He repeated himself. I heard you," she said. "Why?"
Because I want to,
he said. She huffed. "It isn't ready yet."
bring it up when it is.
She opened her mouth to reply, and he added, "Or have one of the other girls do it." The extra kitchen helpers were paid by the army. They couldn't object to waiting on the wardmaster. He left before Daisy could argue any further. Back up in the office, Thomas put the kettle on and explained the situation to Lang, who asked,
Will they really bring it?
"I don't know," Thomas admitted. "If not, I'll have to go down and shout at someone." Lang looked a little worried at that, and Thomas added, "I did some shouting yesterday. Might take it up as a hobby." He regretted his insouciance when, about 10 minutes later, the tray arrived in the hands of none other than Miss Hughes. Hurrying to take it from her, he said, I thought one of the kitchen maids would bring it.
They were a bit busy, she said, and I wanted to see how Henry was faring.
Better,
Lang said cautiously.
thank you.
Good,
She said. Taking a deep breath, she said,
I hope that neither of you feels unwelcome in the servants' hall.
There was absolutely no answer Thomas could give to that, so when Lang didn't supply one either, he said the only thing he could think of.
Would you like a cup of tea?
She looked about as surprised by the question as he was by having asked it.
Thank you,
She finally said.
I will.
He sat in one of their rickety chairs and Thomas fixed her a cup. Sipping it, she said,
This is a bit different, isn't it?
2-pot standard issue, 1 part Fortnum Superior.
Thomas said.
How splendid.
She got the joke, of course. She'd been one of the ones sending them Fortnum Superior in France. She also accepted a piece of toast, which made it possible for Thomas and Lang to start eating.
Will you come down to see William off? She asked as they ate. He's leaving right after breakfast.
I suppose,
Thomas said. Between one thing and another, he hadn't seen much of William yesterday.
I don't believe either of you heard, she added, but he and Daisy are engaged.
Really? Thomas wondered if she'd changed her mind or if something else had happened.
I expect he's over the moon.
Naturally,
Miss Hughes agreed.
and Daisy as well.
Lang put down a piece of toast he'd been toying with.
I hope,
He said, and then very clearly discarded what he'd been planning to finish that sentence with.
they have many happy years together.
As do we all.
Miss Hughes said, answering, Thomas thought, both what Lang had said and what he hadn't. William's engagement to Daisy wouldn't mean much if he didn't come back alive.
His lordship is going to arrange for him to be Mr. Matthew's soldier servant, she added, so he'll have someone looking after him.
Good, Thomas said, and carefully didn't think about how no one here had cared when he went whether he'd have anyone looking after him or not. He had, after all.
Captain Crawley knows what he's about over there.
They spoke a little more of inconsequential matters, mostly how Captain Crawley had seemed, and then Miss Hughes excused herself.
It isn't always much of a help,
Lang said once she had gone.
being an officer servant.
I know, Thomas said.
Crawley's all right, though.
Lang would know that that was high praise.
That was one of his men. We had him in the shell-shock ward over the winter. They sent him back, and in the spring he came through my regular unit with a bullet hole in his foot.
He didn't have to explain to Lang what that meant.
One of our officers wanted to raise a stink, but Captain Crawley, he was the lieutenant then, helped me sort it out. Got him sent home.
Oh, Lang said, looking relieved.
Yeah,
It occurred to Thomas now that this anecdote had a more personal relevance for Lang than he'd initially thought.
I didn't have a chance to talk to him last night.
Which was likely true even if Thomas had thought of it at the time.
But if we needed to work on Colonel Grantham or something, we could get Nurse Crawley to write to him.
Lang absorbed that.
I've been thinking,
He said slowly.
Yeah,
Finished eating, Thomas leaned back in his chair and lit a cigarette.
gardening doesn't sound so bad now. Better than...
Facing Carson, trying to think of something else. In Lang's place, Thomas thought that he'd prefer a spell as an undergardener to either of those. And after last night, almost anything would be easier to swing than getting Lang back into Carson's good graces, or even his begrudging tolerance.
All right,
He said.
we'll get to work on that then.
They went downstairs to see William off, Lang trailing disconsolately behind Thomas. William looked even more fresh-faced and idiotic than usual, beaming at Daisy like he couldn't believe his luck. Thomas was fairly sure he managed to sound sincere in congratulating him and offering Daisy his best wishes. When William headed for the door, arm around Daisy, and the rest of them fell back to give the couple a little privacy, Thomas pulled Bates aside. He'd barely begun reminding Bates of that discussion when Bates said,
I spoke to his lordship about it last night. Is Henry interested now?
Caught slightly flat-footed. He'd been expecting to have to talk Bates into it again. Thomas said,
Yes. His lordship will be glad to hear it.
Bates said.
He'll probably speak to Bassett today. I don't think he has any engagements.
Good, Thomas said.
He isn't going to let Carson sack you either.
Bates added. Thomas didn't point out that Carson couldn't sack him. They both knew that he wouldn't be wardmaster of the convalescent home for long if the Crawleys didn't want him to be.
I figured I was going to have some work to do on that one, he said instead.
I told him I didn't think your men would stand for it, and he said he didn't think her ladyship or Major Clarkson would either.
Bates said.
He's going to talk to Carson about
He looked over towards Carson's pantry.
everything.
So, all Thomas had to do today was run the convalescent home? Thanks! He said and mostly meant it.
Lady Sybil spoke to him first,
Bates said.
about Lang and you.
She had stuck up for him with Carson, but he hadn't expected her to realize on her own that it was going to take more than that. Nurse Crawley, he said. Pretty sure that was Nurse Crawley.
Nurse Crawley, then.
Bates said.
Miss Hughes told me some of what you talked about last night, after dinner.
Automatically, Thomas began reviewing the conversation for anything damaging that he might have said.
Got me thinking.
Bates continued.
We should look out for each other more around here.
Yeah? Thomas asked, suspiciously.
Yeah.
After completing the morning's work, Sybil went to Sergeant Barrow's office with 3 things on her mind. Fortunately, he was there, working on the day book it looked like. Nurse Crawley, he said, standing briefly when she entered and gesturing her to a chair. She sat. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said. I wanted to ask how Henry is this morning. You won't, Barrow said, closing the day book. He's feeling better. Good, she said. Papa said he would sort something out for him. She'd seen Papa briefly at breakfast, and he'd said he thought there was a solution, but he'd come down just a moment before she was due to report for duty, so she hadn't had time to ask for any details. Yes, Barrow said. He's going to work in the gardens for a while, as long as it's all right with Mr. Bassett. Oh, Sybil said, pleased. That's supposed to be one of the best things for shell-shock patients. She'd read it in a copy of the RAMC journal. Yes, Barrow said patiently. Right, she supposed he'd know that himself, having worked with shell-shock cases in France. We'd talked about it before, in fact. He wasn't terribly keen, since it isn't his usual type of work, but that was before the convalescent home came. Sybil nodded. It was fairly dreadful seeing him in the dining room, she confessed. She'd known that, as a trained nurse, she ought to do something, but she hadn't been at all sure what. He was in a bad way, Sergeant Barrow agreed. The pressure of the General's visit, and William going off to the war the next day, and... He seemed to decide not to say whatever was next, but Sybil had a feeling it was about Carson being beastly. Not the sort of thing the doctors had in mind when they suggested he work in the country for his health. I suppose not, she agreed. I'm glad he's feeling better. Since it sounded like Henry was settled, she moved on to her next concern, the one that secretly she found even more pressing. Have you heard anything about Branson? She'd tried to bump Anna for information on the subject when she came up to deal with their evening dresses, but she'd said little except to repeat that his illness wasn't serious. Barrow sighed and looked toward the shelves that separated his office from the area where the orderlies had their tea and smoking breaks. There were 2 or 3 of them out there. I fancy a bit of fresh air, Sergeant Barrow said, if you'd like to join me. Clearly there was something more to hear. Once they were outside, away from prying ears, Thomas lit a cigarette to buy a few more seconds to decide what he was going to tell Nurse Crawley about Branson. He felt obscurely that he oughtn't to lie. But even with that decided, there was the question of how to address the subject without confirming what he knew about her interest in Branson, or eliciting any confessions he'd have to do something about. He considered pretending that Nurse Crawley might be unaware of Branson's political opinions, though if she discussed anything more than ordering the motor with him, she couldn't be. Branson didn't know how to keep his mouth shut, or when he ought to try. And the second time they talked about him, when she declared him insufferable, Nurse Crawley had mentioned him by name. Finally, he decided to open with, Branson wasn't really ill. He wasn't, she said. Then why? He'd planned a dramatic gesture aimed at the General. She didn't, he felt, need to know the details, unless Branson insisted on boasting to her, which was his own lookout. Mr. Carson caught wind of it and yanked him out of the dining room before we could make it. Oh, she said, sounding relieved. Thomas watched as she realized that news was not really something to be relieved about. What's going to happen to him? Last I heard, Mr. Carson had decided not to do anything. Perhaps because if he did, he'd have to admit that he ought to have picked up on it before the last minute. That wasn't the real reason, or at least not the only reason, but now that he wasn't riding high on righteous indignation, Thomas didn't want to discuss his insight about how Carson chose his victims.
He wouldn't tell Papa? She asked. Are you sure?
We aren't exactly in the habit of exchanging confidences, Thomas said dryly. She ought to know that after what she'd seen last night. But he said something about not thinking it was very important since he didn't succeed in doing what he planned. Nurse Crawley bit her lip.
What was his plan? He wasn't going to hurt anyone, was he?
No. He decided not to mention that they'd all jumped to the conclusion it was an assassination plot. Not a flattering thing to hear about one's beau. He just meant to raise a stink. More literally than Nurse Crawley would probably take it, but there was no lie in it.
She nodded. He did say he wanted to make the British government look foolish, she noted. But here? After all the work we did to make a good impression on the General?
Maybe, Thomas thought, she'd give Branson an earful on the subject. It was the least he deserved. He didn't seem to have thought it through very well.
I thought about going over at lunchtime to see if he needed anything, she said. It seems what he needs is a piece of my mind.
Might do some good, Thomas agreed. His cigarette was about finished, so he took the final drag and tossed it aside. He turned to go back in, but Nurse Crawley put a hand on his arm.
Wait, she said. I wanted to ask about Carson, too.
Why? Carson wasn't ill, he was just a break. What about him?
I hope he isn't being too beastly.
Oh, I've managed to avoid him so far this morning.
Papa's going to speak to him,
she added. Carson, Thomas would bet, would have quite a bit he wanted to say to his lordship, too. Well, he'd had a quiet morning, at least. I see.
Is it true that he hit you?
Thomas really wished he hadn't mentioned that. It was a long time ago, when I first came to work here. But why did he... I don't really want to discuss it, Thomas interrupted.
She nodded. All right. But he doesn't do that regularly, does he? Hit the footman?
He doesn't, Thomas said. Nurse Crawley nodded again and said,
Because if he did, Papa would have to know.
As far as I know, that was the only time. Did that mean she hadn't told his lordship that part already? Thomas hoped not, and that Bates hadn't either. As a matter of fact, last night wasn't the first time I wished he'd tried again so I could hit him back. He'd meant to lighten the mood, but instead Nurse Crawley looked more worried.
Does he speak to you like that often?
Sometimes, Thomas admitted. We've never gotten on.
He shouldn't, she said.
Had anyone ever said that before? Thomas didn't think so. I know. He looked toward the house again. We both have work to be doing. They went inside and got back to work. By lunchtime, Griff had gotten hold of some version of what had happened the night before, likely from Ethel, and was gleefully recounting it to the other orderlies when Thomas got to the breakfast room. Once they'd all stood up and Thomas had as you word them, someone asked, Sarge, is it true you told that Carson you'd beat the living daylights out of him? Mr. Carson, Thomas corrected as he put meat and potatoes onto his plate. The word I used was living shit, and I said I would do, except he wasn't worth going to prison for. He didn't want them getting any ideas about carrying out his threat. There was a general murmur of approval, and then Griff turned to recounting Nurse Crawley's part of the story. So, Carson and Sarge didn't know she was even in the room. They were facing the other way, and she says, I don't. She's a brick, Wiggins said admiringly. Ain't she? Griff agreed. So then Carson, Mr. Carson, was falling over himself. My lady this and my lady that. Wish I'd seen it. It had been considerably less entertaining in reality than in Griff's third-hand retelling, but Thomas supposed a lot of armor stories were like that.
He used some language he shouldn't have, my lord, particularly in mixed company,
Miss Hughes concluded.
And of course Mr. Carson isn't used to being contradicted in public, but it may be that a short, sharp shock was needed to make him take notice.
Perhaps, Robert agreed. He'd been talking to the servants since morning, summoning them to his office one by one, and had learned that the internal politics of the servants' hall were every bit as complicated as those of a barracks, which perhaps shouldn't have been a surprise. All accounts had agreed on the issue of Thomas's language, with varying levels of circumlocution about what, precisely, he had said,
and most agreed that what Thomas had said had been a long time coming, if injudiciously expressed. The glaring exception, unsurprisingly, was Carson, who had managed to imply without quite saying so that this was only the most recent and public of a number of hysterical outbursts.
It's been suggested, Robert said delicately, that Carson perhaps does not understand that, as wardmaster of the convalescent home, Sergeant Barrow is not under his authority.
Miss Hughes hesitated. Begging your pardon, my lord, but if he doesn't understand, it's because he chooses not to. We all have a bit of difficulty with, remembering we ought to call him Sergeant Barrow now, and not Thomas, but...
She drilled off. Yes, I've had trouble with that too.
He's taught you about it, my lord, and Mr. Carson knows it. I suppose you heard about the silver.
Yes.
At great length from Carson, who had seemed not to understand that he was digging himself in deeper the more details he provided about the disagreement. All I can say about that is he and I found it quite simple to arrange the extra cleaning for the General's visit. We went round the house together to see what needed to be done, and then agreed which tasks were more suited to his men, and which to the housemates.
The contrast with how Carson had, by his own admission, approached the matter of the silver was fairly stark.
I see. And just so I know I've covered everything, has the head laundress mentioned finding him difficult to work with?
Not particularly, my lord. She grumbles about the extra work, and she doesn't like any of the solutions Sergeant Barrow has suggested. Having one or two of the men help when things are especially busy, or asking her ladyship to see if the War Office might pay for another laundry maid. But she's always been that way.
Robert had known plenty of men like that in his army days, ones who would rather have something to grouse about than otherwise, and he supposed there was no reason a woman couldn't be the same way.
I understand. Thank you, Miss Hughes. You've been very helpful.
Thank you, my lord,
she said, and hesitated.
Is there something else?
I only wondered what's to become of Henry, my lord,
she said. It looks like he's going to work in the gardens for a while, Robert said. I haven't had a chance to work out the details with Bassett yet, but I think he'll agree. If he doesn't, we'll think of something else.
He'd spoken to all of the service now, and while he was going to have to circle back around to Carson, there was one more person he needed to hear from first.
If you're able to locate Sergeant Barrow, tell him I'd like to speak to him as soon as it's convenient.
Fuck! Thomas had been looking forward to a cigarette between dressing changes and Major Clarkson's rounds, but he couldn't pretend not to understand what "as soon as it's convenient" meant coming from an officer. At least Colonel Grantham wasn't saving this for after Major Clarkson had arrived. Not being in Thomas's chain of command, he'd need to bring in Thomas's commanding officer if he meant to do anything more than tell him off. He could, of course, mean to involve the Major later, but with foreknowledge of what Colonel Grantham had to say and a bit of maneuvering, he could get his side of the story in front of Major Clarkson first. He went into Grantham's study, another saving grace it wasn't the small library where his men might have overheard, and braced up. "Sir!" Grantham was sitting behind his desk, and for a moment Thomas was reminded of being in the same position in the wardmaster's office. He wasn't about to be offered a drink this time.
"Sergeant," Grantham said, "first off, I don't think I need to tell you that certain kinds of language are not appreciated in this house."
So they were starting with that. "Yes, sir."
"Miss Hughes tells me that she spoke to you about this at some length. She considers that you were highly provoked and believes that you will control yourself better in the future. Is that true?"
That wasn't quite how Thomas had expected this to go. "Yes, sir."
"Good. In that case, I don't think Major Clarkson needs to be apprised, but I won't be so tolerant a second time."
"Really?" "Yes, sir."
"Very well. At ease."
Moving his feet apart and putting his hands behind his back, Thomas wondered if Colonel Grantham really meant to imply that the bollocking portion of the program was finished. It didn't seem at all likely, but what Grantham said next suggested he had.
"I've given to understand that Carson's attitude toward the convalescent home staff has been less welcoming than one would wish."
Thomas's first thought was to wonder what sort of a trap this could be, perhaps to see if he'd give in to the temptation to slag off Carson. "I agree, sir. Miss Hughes tells me he's found the adjustment difficult." That surely sounded reasonable and had the advantage of being perfectly true.
Thomas didn't need to share that he was past giving a flying fuck at a donut about how Carson felt about anything.
Yes, she explained that to me as well. Nevertheless, I'll be speaking to him about what's expected of him and making sure that he understands the role of the RAMC personnel.
Did Thomas dare to hope that he meant he'd tell Carson they weren't meant to be polishing silver?
Yes, sir, Colonel Grantham added. It's not unreasonable to suppose that since our household staff are doing some work in support of the convalescent home, that the convalescent home staff might occasionally return the favor. But he must understand that it is a favor, and that the men's official duties take precedence.
So Carson could try to make them polish silver again if he was polite about it. And Thomas suspected he would try.
Yes, sir, that seems fair,
he said, filing away the bit about official duties taking precedence for when Carson needed reminding of it.
Meanwhile, I also expect you to continue as you have been, to do what you can to smooth out this adjustment for everyone.
Not open season on Carson, Thomas translated. Also fair, if not what he would have liked.
Yes, sir. I understand that Miss Hughes, Miss Patmore, and Miss Coulter are all satisfied with your work in that regard,
the colonel added. Thomas mentally filed that away too, as a model for how to talk about the things your men hadn't messed up without sounding stupid.
That's kind of them to say, sir. Finally, I understand that you found Carson's handling of Henry's difficulties distressing.
Now Thomas supposed he was going to hear about how it wasn't any of his business how Carson handled his staff. He couldn't argue with that, even if he could argue with Colonel Grantham about anything, unless he wanted to let Carson interfere with how he managed his people, but it was going to rankle.
Yes, sir. I appreciate your coming up with a solution. I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of dismissing him, but it didn't seem like it would serve him well to force Carson to keep him on, either.
Thomas wasn't sure what he was supposed to say to that, so he went with, yes, sir, which was usually a safe bet.
However, if a similar situation arises again, I'd like to be brought into the picture sooner.
Sir,
I'm sure you don't wish to bet tails, but it seems that Carson may need more direction when it comes to how we'd like the staff to be managed,
Colonel Grantham added. The world tilted slightly on its axis, and Thomas realized that if Carson was their NCO and his lordship was their officer, it was, in fact, his lordship's fucking job to make sure Carson knew how to do his.
Yes, sir. Very well. I won't keep you from your duties any further.
Thomas braced up again and left, trying to sort out what had just happened. The shape of things didn't really become clear until near the end of the shift, when the men were taking the officers their dinners and Thomas was in his office going over Sister Crawley's suggestions for the next week's duty roster. There was a tap on the open door, and then Anna peered around the linen shelves.
"Oh, good," she said. "I don't have to track you down."
"What is it now?" Thomas asked wearily.
"Miss Hughes wants to know if you'll be joining us for dinner or if you'd like a tray here."
Thomas had, in fact, been wondering something similar, though it was more like whether he was going to be told off for being demanding or informed that he was now banished from the servants' hall until the war ended and Carson could finally be shot of him for good.
"I'm not sure,"
he said. How convenient that there was someone he could consult.
"Did she give you any idea which answer she was looking for?"
With a glance toward the door, Anna said,
"It might be best if you went on making yourself scarce for a day or two. His lordship's laid down the law to Mr. Carson, and, well, I expect all of us would have trays elsewhere if we had the choice."
"Oh?" Thomas said.
"He was talking to people all day,"
Anna said, perching on the edge of a chair.
"His lordship, I mean. Not me, but Mr. Bates and Mr. Carson and Miss Patmore. Miss Hughes was with him for over an hour. He seems to have sorted out that Mr. Carson bullied Henry into a nervous breakdown, and that none of the convalescent home people can stand him. Mr. Carson was about that close to handing in his notice."
She held her fingers a fraction of an inch apart.
"But he seems to have decided to stay."
"What a shame," Thomas said, because this was his office and he could say what he liked in it.
"Don't say that,"
Anna objected, but her heart didn't seem to be in it, so Thomas ignored it. "There must have been something in that about me," he said instead. So far, this was all sounding almost too good to be true. Anna rolled her eyes slightly.
"Yes, well, when he first brought up handing in his notice, he said he'd do it if his lordship didn't get rid of you somehow.
That sounded more like it. What did his lordship say?
That it would be a shame to lose him after all these years.
Not in Thomas's opinion. And
then Mr. Carson hemmed and hawed for a bit and said he wasn't having you back after the war for all the tea and china.
I never thought he would, Thomas pointed out. Anna frowned a bit at that, but said,
His lordship said they'd discuss that when the time came, but for the duration he was to cooperate fully, and if he didn't think he was able, he'd accept his notice.
Fuck me blind. Are you saying, Thomas said carefully, that Carson said it was him or me, and his lordship picked me?
I don't expect his lordship likes being pushed into a corner no more than anyone else does, Anna said. If the next time it's you who pick the fight, he won't like that either.
Understood, Thomas said. I expect you're right about making myself scarce. He must be on a tear. If Thomas was reeling from this sudden reversal of fortune, that had to go double for Carson. Something else occurred to him. Where's Lang? He can eat up here with me if he wants.
He went to have supper with Mr. Bassett, Anna said. He'll move out tomorrow if everything goes well.
Good, Thomas said. Who's waiting at table tonight?
Anna sighed. Ethel and me.
That's going to be fun, Thomas noted.
At least it's just the family,
Anna said resignedly. She stood up.
Speaking of dinner, the dressing gown's about to go.
See you tomorrow, I guess.
It seemed strange that he wouldn't be finishing the day downstairs with everyone else.